The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 376 Planning. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Metternich was shocked by the news that Archduke Albrecht was leading an army. Also disappearing were his escorts, Franz's royal dragoons, and the 1,000 elite troops drawn from the garrison near Vienna. It is extraordinary that these 5,000 men dare to attack Belgium and the Netherlands. According to common sense, no matter how well equipped this army is and how brave the soldiers are, this move is the same as sending death. Another point is that as a member of the royal family, Albrecht leading the army to the expedition has other meanings. It represents the attitude of the royal family. Although Metternich tried to suppress bellicose remarks through public opinion, the spectacular scene of thousands of officers and soldiers boarding the train at the railway station was clearly captured by the citizens of Vienna. This is more lethal than 100,000 newspapers, not to mention that the flag of the German Confederate Volunteer Army is simply a magic weapon for swindling. Austria itself has a tradition of volunteer soldiers. Now, the news that soldiers from all over the world responded to the call and set off for Luxembourg in groups soon spread to other German states, and the locals followed suit so much that the government wanted to can't stop it. Albrecht was an impulsive, but not reckless young man. The reason why he acted so resolutely was because Archduke Franz was behind the plan, which made him so unhesitating. His Royal Highness, what exactly did you say to Archduke Albrecht? Do you know? You have triggered an armed conflict in Europe. Originally this was a war within the German Confederation, but now our country is also involved. Metternich had a very helpless expression. This sudden change obviously made him very embarrassed. It seemed that the smart student had not convinced the teacher before. I just told him that soldiers are valuable and quick. Franz answered frankly that, since he could not convince the other party of his judgment, he should prove it with actual actions. But now we are going deep alone. Once Archduke Albrecht is defeated and captured, it will be a political disaster for the empire. Metternich spoke earnestly. He still admired Franz's previous strategy of combining vertical and horizontal directions. Although it seemed unreasonable, it still had some maneuverability. But it was extremely stupid to act rashly at this moment, which really made him feel very regretful. Is the empire really going to fall into the hands of a reckless man? However, what appears to be a naive diplomatic strategy and seemingly recklessness are actually a combination of punches. However, Franz was not interested in starting a new conversation with an old man who was nearly 70 years old at this time, so he replied calmly, Prime Minister, the way you want to avoid political disaster now is neither to complain nor to question me. Instead, you should fully support Archduke Albrecht's actions. Metternich was inevitably a little unhappy when a child said this, but due to the identity and situation of the other party, he really had no time to delay and must fully support this reckless and stupid war. I also want to solemnly remind you that Britain is indeed very powerful, but it is not invulnerable. If you don't even have the courage to challenge, you might as well swim to the other side of the channel and become a British person. Franz's slightly sarcastic words made the old prime minister stop in his tracks, but he still did not choose to look back and left directly. After Metternich walked away, Franz turned to the darkness and said, Archbishop, there are 1.6 million German-speaking Catholics in Belgium. If they are unwilling to live in the Netherlands, I hope they can reach the empire safely. You can do it. Educating the world and protecting believers is the responsibility of the church, and we will do our best. Franz nodded, not expecting that at this critical moment, the most unreliable person would be the most reliable. Due to the activities of the church, the resistance of the people in Belgium was not fierce. Of course, Franz also briefly explained to Archduke Albrecht the three major disciplines, the 8 points of attention, preferential treatment of prisoners of war, etc. Franz was not the same kind as the gambling-loving shower advisors and Junkers officers. Regardless of whether Albrecht wins or loses, the goal of knocking the mountain and shaking the tiger has been achieved, and the rest is garbage time wrangling. Of course, he didn't think his uncle would have any surprises. If he could still be defeated by an unsuspecting opponent while taking advantage of the right time, place, and people, then he might as well pack up and give up the fight for hegemony. Assembling carefully selected elite troops in the country, equipped with the most advanced weapons at the moment, relying on the tactics of rapid troop transport to attack unsuspecting enemies, coupled with a large amount of detailed intelligence. Even if the Belgians asked God to put on a steel helmet, they would fight, not winning this battle. To an eagle-eyed few, this was the first time railroads were used in war. According to common sense, it would take 1 to 3 months for the German Confederation to mobilize and increase its troops. Such a large-scale operation to Luxembourg would take about 2 months, and another 1 to 2 weeks would be wasted for unified scheduling and assignment of tasks. At this time, Austria's forced march speed was 15 to 20 km per day, and the forced march speed was 30 to 40 km per day, but most of the time the march speed was about 10 km. During the Battle of Solferino, which was the Second Italian War of Independence, the Austrians also achieved the miracle of marching 1.5 km per day. With the Empire's transportation capabilities at this time, there is no problem at all in delivering 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers to Luxembourg every day. It is not impossible to double this number if we go all out, but that will affect the economy and trade. However, this number is exaggerated when extended to the entire German Confederation, which can deliver more than 20,000 troops every day. Therefore, in a very short period of time, hundreds of thousands of volunteers from the German Confederation gathered in the Luxembourg area. After Franz and his men reviewed the information and investigated, they found that, although France has 150,000 troops in the north, only General Jane Durd's 20,000 troops could rush to the front within a week. Other troops wanted to enter France. It takes at least half a month and the border crossing. Theoretically, the French should not send troops to go deep alone. After all, there is a hidden danger that the risk is too high, and after their troops are assembled, they will suddenly find that the number of opponents exceeds their imagination, and there is a high probability that they have already completed the attack set objectives by that time. Unless the French are crazy, it will be too late to intervene. After all, the hundreds of thousands of troops entrenched in Wallonia and Flemish are not for nothing. From another perspective, even if the French really fought with the German Confederation regardless of the consequences, the Russians and British would not share their fate with it. At this moment, the Russian economy is already bound to the Austrian market, and the two sides are separated by the Carpathian Mountains. The Russian army is obviously insufficient to fight in Poland. It may take 3 years to mobilize troops from southern Russia and Siberia, months or even half a year. As for the Anglo-Saxons, they were born merchants. They would most likely turn against their neighbors across the sea and confiscate the French colonies. This is the best choice for Britain, and even the unification of the Netherlands cannot threaten their interests. Prussia and Austria are both land powers, and they are both members of the German Confederation. The two sides are in a competitive relationship. Although this move weakened France, it also made the military power of Europe more balanced. At this time, Prussia and Austria were inferior to France both economically and militarily. However, the development of the war did not exactly go according to Franz's estimation. The appearance of Jane Duld and Old Moltke's gambling tactics changed the situation. Chapter 377 Napoleon is alive. January 4, 1843 UK, London. 10 Downing Street. The bombshell news that the French army had sent troops to besiege Namur reached England, causing Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne to breathe a sigh of relief. By God, those damn French guys scared my heart out. Thank God, the combat effectiveness of the German Confederate Army is still as low as ever. Even though they had been planning for this day for decades, they still failed miserably in the end. Now I really want to take a closer look to see if the faces of the German kings and grand dukes are swollen, but what we should do at this time is to immediately urge the procrastinating Russians to get off the field and join the war as soon as possible. The rest of the cabinet nodded in agreement, but unfortunately the British commissioner who was on his way to St. Petersburg to deliver the message was still on his waypoint. Although the Netherlands had joined the German Federation at this time, the French army was advancing too fast. If they directly captured Namur and then Liège, it would not only mean that Belgium had been recovered, but it would also cut off the connection between the Netherlands and the German region. Contact information point. This made the Anglo-Saxons, who were proficient in balancing, have to worry about the German Confederation. After all, if the latter lost too quickly, it would directly affect their strategic ambitions and money-making plans. Belgium. Outside Brussels, although Leopold I had not yet signed his name on the armistice, Albrecht received the king with the highest courtesy. The opponent is indeed a tough guy as rumored. Although he was captured, he is still full of confidence in the battle situation. Grand Duke Albrecht, I admit that the speed of your army's march is far beyond my expectation. But have you ever thought about it? If the French army sends troops to cut off your retreat at this time, will you be in danger in the near future? What if you end up with the same fate as me, your Majesty the King? You are worrying too much. Even if there are hundreds of thousands of pigs guarding the Walloon area, the 20,000 French troops will not be able to capture them all in 3 days. Albrecht was confident of this because France could only commit 1 quarter the area within a weak point. Based on the information currently available, Prussia's military strength in this area alone has reached 2 armies. Counting an army invested by itself and other countries in the near future, the total military strength will soar to about 150,000. Coupled with the fact that they had previously occupied most of the strategic locations in the Wallonia region, it was extremely difficult for the French to cut off the retreat route of the German Confederate Army. What's more, his nephew repeatedly assured himself that, as long as the plan to attack Belgium went smoothly, France would not dare to launch an attack. Leopold I was a little surprised by the other party's insights into the direction of the current situation. You kidding me? How can there be an army of hundreds of thousands? Can all your soldiers fly? Albrecht just smiled and replied, it would be more interesting to uncover the mystery yourself. But before he could finish his words, a messenger hurried over because he was walking too fast and didn't pay attention to his steps. He accidentally tripped over the camp threshold and fell. His face was stained with blood from the wounds, and he looked miserable. The soldier with frightened eyes looked at the King of Belgium in confusion. I'll avoid it. You guys talk. Leopold I stood up with a smile. The meaning of the scene that just happened was very clear to him. The enemy's disadvantages are definitely good news for yourself and the kingdom. Albrecht glanced at the messenger with great displeasure. He knew that the military situation he was about to announce might be detrimental to his own side, but he did not want to embolden others, so he said calmly to the adjutant, "You can recite it here. There is no need to avoid His Majesty the King." "Yes, Your Excellency the Grand Duke." The adjutant took the document, and after just one glance, he was immediately at a loss. There were beads of sweat on his head, and he pulled up his collar, then leaned over and whispered to his superior. "My lord, I'm afraid that the words in this report may be undignified." At this critical moment, Albrecht did not have the energy to talk to his subordinates. He was so impatient that he threw the coffee cup on the table in anger. "Why are you talking so much? If you are asked to recite it, just recite it happily." "Yes, the 2nd Army, 3rd Army, 4th Army, and 5th Army of the German Confederate Volunteers were all defeated in yesterday's battle. His Excellency Prince Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Forces, was trapped in Namibia. We are in urgent need of rescue." Report completed. After listening, Albrecht's vision went dark, and he almost fainted. The development of the situation was beyond his expectation. This started 2 days ago. The French army was singing and attacking all the way, which made Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig lose face, so he decided to gather a large army to encircle and suppress them. At this time, his chief of staff, Moltke, was keenly aware that his opponent was in great strength, and if the Prussian army took the lead, it would be impossible to compete with it. More importantly, the Austrians, who have been in the limelight since the war began, have basically suffered no losses. If they make any major mistakes again, they may not be able to explain to Berlin. As a result, Moltke suddenly came up with the idea of using the Saxons as human shields, and then the Prussian troops who detected leaks would go up to cut the wheat. What's more, the morale of Saxony's 3rd Army was already in a strong state at this time. especially after the Austrian army made great progress. They also wanted to compare with it. Unfortunately, ideals are full and reality is skinny. Old Moltke's conspiracy was easily noticed by General Flatten of Bavaria, and he explained to his colleagues that this move was the Prussians' attempt to use the hands of the French to weaken these Germans. The power of the country. After learning the truth, the morale of the Saxon army dropped to freezing point in an instant. They did not want to be cannon fodder for the Prussians, so they used the excuse that the soldiers were acclimatized and could not go to war. Subsequently, the Prussian envoy was ordered to rush to the Bavarian army's camp. General Fullerton of the opposing 4th Army was a veteran, and of course he knew the intention of the visitor. However, he was cunning and did not refuse directly. Instead, he cried out and asked for more money, food, and supplies. Although the Prussian side felt a bit at a loss, it was still more cost effective than serving as cannon fodder, so old Moltke formulated a jealous and dangerous encirclement and suppression plan. He planned to use the Bavarian 4th Army to withstand the French attack in the front, and then let Hanover's 5th Army lead a miscellaneous army to outflank the Saxon army from the right. The three armies led a motley army to outflank the left wing. In the end, the Prussian 2nd Army completed the final blow against the French army, using the strong strength of 6 corps to encircle the lone French corps. This kind of tactical gamble involves a lot of components, but once executed successfully, the benefits are also huge. In history, Moltke often formulated this kind of military adventure strategy. But if you analyze it afterwards, you can see how dangerous and full of loopholes his tactics were. His tactics often require strong execution, but who would have thought that after the encirclement and suppression of the Bavarian army began, they would just stand still and let the French break through their own defenses. The French army, which drove straight in, caught the Prussian army by surprise, but the Hanoverian 5th Army, which came to the rescue later, was scattered by the latter's rout. Immediately afterwards, a great rout occurred, and the rest of the motley army of the German Confederacy was also dragged into this rout. Faced with a devastating defeat, the Bavarian and Saxon armies naturally did not want to repeat the same mistakes. As a result, the French army of less than 20,000 people gained a lot. They not only defeated the encirclement and suppression army of the German Confederacy, but also successfully surrounded the main forces of the two Prussian armies in the city of Namur like a chain reaction. After triggering a domino, even the Austrian officers and soldiers responsible for garrisoning the Liege fortress were affected, and had to send people to Vienna overnight for help. Liege fortress east of Namur, which is the rear fortress of the German Confederation, Wallonia, outside Namur. To be honest, Jane Derd was relatively cautious at first, but after the consecutive victories in the past few days, he became a little arrogant. He felt that he could compare with the soul of France like Napoleon, and maybe he would go one step further to become the Caesar who unified Europe. However, although the German Confederate army was vulnerable, the proud general encountered a new problem, that is, logistical supply difficulties. However, in his eyes, this was not a big problem at all, because Emperor Napoleon had already set an example with practical actions, defeating the enemy with food. After thinking about it, Jane Dord immediately ordered the soldiers to plunder the place. You must know that many soldiers at that time went to war not to get military pay, but to rob. After all, the income obtained through the latter channel is far from comparable to the pitiful military salary, not to mention the opportunity to do some things that you usually dare not do. The result was an outpouring of mourning throughout Wallonia. The soldiers of the German Confederate Volunteer Army who had passed through before regarded them as Luxembourgers or Austrian Netherlands. In addition, Archduke Albrecht took the lead in using money to purchase supplies, so the military generals of other countries were embarrassed to speak out publicly and maintained relative restraint. However, the arrogant French generals who had just won the victory did the opposite. Without any restraint or scruples, they ravaged the area as victors and laid the groundwork for future defeat. Of course, until this time, Jane Derd did not know how many people there were in the German Confederate Volunteer Army. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 378 The wrong use of giving food to the enemy. It is used for the country, because the food is given to the enemy, so the army can have enough food. The Art of War, March 27, 1796. Italy, Savoy. Nice. When Napoleon first arrived in Italy, he reviewed his troops. What he saw was an army of beggars in ragged clothes, underfed, and with low morale. No well-connected French general will accept the position of commander of the Italian army. Only now did he understand the true meaning of this sentence. This is an abandoned army. Not only were the officials in Paris unwilling to provide it with supplies, but the soldiers and officers under its command did not know what military discipline was, and theft was common. The 43,000 people in the entire army had no military pay, no military rations, no feed, no shoes and socks, no clothes, no tents, no camping furniture, no means of transportation. And their material life was extremely poor. The hungry troops robbed and stole everywhere. Rebellions and desertions occurred from time to time, and morale was very low. Napoleon clearly realized that, if he wanted to improve the combat effectiveness of the army, he had to improve military discipline. But was it easier said than done? Just shooting some people won't help at all. What the officers and soldiers under their command really need is to eat well and wear warm clothes. After they have money, they can mail it to their families. These necessities would not be provided by Paris, and they had to be exacted from the enemy at bayonet point. Hence his famous speech, "Soldiers, you are short of food and clothing. The Republic owes you a lot, but the country does not have the power to repay the debt. I'm here to lead you into the richest plains in the world. The rich provinces and wealthy towns are all at the mercy of you. Dispose of it." Soldiers, faced with such a prospect, can you not muster up the courage to persevere? This was his first speech to the soldiers, but it was enough to go down in history. Since then, under the outstanding command of this young commander, the Italian army has achieved successive victories in Piedmont. Piedmont, the gateway to northern Italy, was opened by Napoleon in less than a month, and his generous promises were successfully fulfilled. The troops received a large amount of supplies. Back to business at this time. Jane d'Urde also wanted to imitate the former emperor, and the French soldiers who were familiar with that illusion also began to work hard on their old profession, robbery. The Wallonia region is worthy of being a prosperous place, and the French officers and soldiers gained a lot. In just one day, they robbed enough food for them to consume for several months, and even the weapons and ammunition were fully replenished. Not to mention that the looted property was enough to pay them dozens of military pay. In addition, they temporarily established 12 military prostitution camps, including a hospital dedicated to treating syphilis. That year, Napoleon achieved 6 victories in 15 days, and captured 21 military flags. He was so excited that he couldn't sleep well for a month. Now, Jane d'Urde has achieved 9 victories and captured dozens of military flags in just one day, which is a unique achievement in the entire European history. Therefore, his entire body had expanded to an unbelievable extent. Not only did he surround Prussia's 40,000 main force with only more than 10,000 people, but he also divided 5,000 people to continue to pursue the remaining enemy, intending to capture the Liege fortress as well. Usually when siege a city is surrounded by 3 and 1 is missing, it is convenient for the enemy to cover up and kill him when he is escaping, so as to achieve the purpose of breaking the enemy's morale and annihilating the enemy's main force. However, Jane d'Urde did not intend to let go of a Prussian. His purpose was to complete his victory in one battle and completely eliminate the effective forces of the German Confederation. Albrecht's leading reconnaissance force ran into the French reconnaissance outposts in the Walloon area and had a fierce exchange of fire with them. On one side were elites who had experienced many battles, and on the other side were fledgling calves, but with high morale. The hunters of both sides struggled together in the swamps and hills, fighting with all their strength. In the end, they were able to eliminate this tenacious sentinel force through a tip from the Walloon locals. After the battle, it was discovered that this so-called force only had less than 500 people, but it managed to exert the momentum of 5,000 people, and even suppressed the Austrian vanguard with 3,000 people. At one time, however, before Albrecht had time to reprimand his men for their incompetence, he immediately sent 5,000 of his most elite cavalry to launch a probing attack on the French defense line, and then led his 20,000 elite and French troops under the city of Namur. Start a decisive battle point at this moment. He was ready to burn the boat point. Although they encountered an outpost, the strength of this force was far beyond his understanding, and the rest of the French troops in Belgium, who broke into it, would probably be even stronger than this. Albrecht was vaguely worried. If he could not quickly defeat the French army in Namur, he was afraid that the 100,000 Dutch troops behind him would immediately switch sides and stab him in the back point. By that time, he was Austria's eternal sinner, and he even regretted whether he should have listened to Franz's advice and shouldered the responsibility of garrisoning the Walloon region, leaving the rest to the Dutch and Belgians. But now I can't control that much. I can only hope that time is on my side. Wallonia, city of Namur. The Prussian soldiers in the city were trembling. They didn't know exactly how many French troops were besieging the city in front of them. It might be 100,000, or it might be 200,000. In short, their situation was very bad, and the feeling of being surrounded was extremely uncomfortable. Prince Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig, the proud deputy commander-in-chief of the German Confederate Army, resolutely refused to surrender to his opponents, and it seemed that he had made plans for a last-ditch effort. The morale of the officers and soldiers fell to the bottom, and the groans of the wounded soldiers, who were trampled by their own people, echoed throughout the military camp. The civilians of Namur originally planned to cooperate with the French inside and outside, but the news that continued to come from outside the city proved that this group of French troops were simply beasts in human skin. In order to avoid being plundered by the beasts outside the city, they spontaneously organized militia to help defend the city. But even this cannot change the low morale of the Prussian army. Fortunately, Namur is a strong city and should be able to wait for reinforcement to arrive. The French army outside the city lived a life like an emperor. It was even so exaggerated that almost every accompanying soldier was accompanied by a temporarily recruited prostitute. There were also 2 civilian husbands waiting for dispatch. They drank fine red wine and ate. It is ham that common people can only eat once a year. Jane used the residence of a high official as his temporary headquarters. He had just executed 3 mayors for incompetent work and was enjoying the pleasure that power brought him. I'll give you a week. I want 100,000 young men to carry their weapons and follow me through Berlin. Then I will destroy Vienna first and then massacre Moscow. The senior officials of Hainaut province and Brabant province managed to smile. I'm sorry, dear General Jane Turd. Our 2 provinces only have 600,000 people. 100,000 young men are equivalent to 1/6 of the population. It is really difficult to do. As for the weapons, we have previously donated them to France. The inventory has been emptied. Ah, those rags called weapons? Jane Derd raised his gun and pointed it at the 2 senior officials with disdain, and the latter immediately raised his hands obediently. General, we really have no choice. Otherwise, how about this? When you capture Namur province, we 3 provinces will work together to find a solution. Before he finished speaking, a deafening explosion suddenly came from outside. As the advance team sent by Albrecht, his 5,000 cavalry had arrived outside the city of Namur. The commander, Major General Gabrens, found that the French army was resting and unprepared and seemed to be holding a celebration party, so he decisively launched a surprise attack. These 5,000 elites carried cavalry cannons and rocket launchers with them. After all, cavalry attacking the trenches was tantamount to death. Soon, 50 arranged rocket launchers and 36-pound cavalry guns launched a fire coverage on the French army's north gate position. Who would have expected that at this moment, the powerful enemy, instead of hiding in the trenches, would be swaggering in the open space, singing, dancing, drinking and having fun. When rounds of rockets exploded above their heads, there was no way they could find anything to cover their bodies. Sudden fireworks show instantly caused the French army outside the North City gate to lose a lot of effectiveness, and then the sharpshooters began to count the remaining enemies. A stunned French army was unable to organize an effective counterattack. The most ridiculous thing was that the Prussian officers in the city actually thought this was just a fireworks display point, the Prussian troops admiring the fireworks at the top of the city and the Austrian troops chasing the remaining enemies below the city, formed a strange and ridiculous scene point when French troops from other places arrived to support. A deafening explosion sounded again on the west side of Namur. Chapter 379 Battle of Namur. In the west of Namur city, an unknown amount of time passed, and a French infantry regiment responsible for supporting the northern city gate was almost wiped out. Only less than 600 people of this 2,500 person siege team survived. Those who survived either thought they were just a dream, or you will be seriously injured and unable to fight again. This battle was Jane first defeat since breaking through the Franco-Belgian border, and the defeat was so disastrous that he lost nearly 1/3 of his troops. Ironically, after suffering such heavy losses, his officers could not effectively distinguish the number of the opponent. They only roughly knew that it was a large-scale cavalry group. As for what weapons were used and what tactics were used, no one knew which German army belonged to them. Enraged, Jane immediately shot his 2 regiment leaders. Although he did not have the right, he could not control so much at this time. The top priority is to return to the Hainaut province, which is located on the French-Belgian border, to replenish the supplies of the soldiers and wait for reinforcement. Although he was reluctant to give up the opportunity to be a hero, the fact before him was that a powerful enemy army was already targeting him. After finishing his thinking, Jane ordered his men to quickly gather the remaining troops who had survived the siege of Namur and take away everything they could and destroy everything they could not take away. No items could be left to the enemy. Senior officials from the Hainaut province and the Brabant province all said that they would not go to France together, but Jane lips curved. "We are heroes who are here to save you. Do you want to betray us and become the lackeys of the German Confederacy?" Facing the black hole of gunfire, the 2 senior officials said in succession, "Don't dare, don't dare. Long live France, long live General Dord." Jane nodded with great satisfaction, and just as he was about to go out, a messenger stumbled in. "Report. The general has discovered the German Confederate Army, the First Army of Austria. You've come at the right time. I'm fighting the elites. Brothers, follow me and break through the encirclement head on." On January 5, 1843, General Jane died. 7,000 French troops were killed, and 8,000 were captured. In the city of Namur, Albrecht finally met Prince Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig, deputy commander-in-chief of the coalition forces, who had been besieged for several days. "Grand Duke Albrecht, you are our savior. You are quite like a father. You also have the style of your ancestors. The capital was captured in 18 days. But now you are blocked in the city with twice the superior force of your opponent." Albrecht muttered in a low voice. "What did you just say?" "Nothing. I meant to shock you. These damn French people did not abide by the covenant and actually attacked their allies privately. How about leaving them to your army to deal with?" Albrecht didn't care about these prisoners. It was better to say that they were hot potatoes. Franz said that the prisoners should be treated preferentially, but at this time, the princes of the German Confederation obviously resented them deeply, and the local people also said that they would be punished. Albrecht simply threw the pot to Prussia, and was able to do it as a favor. Prince Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig's attitude immediately changed from gratitude for being rescued to reverence at this moment. Because from the latter's perspective, the former gave himself the credit, which was the key to saving Prussia's face. So, he asked with concern, "What about you?" "Haha, I'm afraid I have to rush back to China immediately to prove that I'm still alive. After all, Vienna is in chaos right now." Indeed, as Albrecht said, Friedrich was clamoring to attack the French mainland from Tauland to avenge his eldest brother. Franz was also prepared to go to the front, and named Julius Jacob von Hainaut as his deputy. This Hainaut is also known as the executioner of Erard, the hyena of Brescia and the tiger of Habsburg. In short, he is a ruthless character. If he is allowed to fight such a war with a revenge nature, I'm afraid that the lives of all people will really be destroyed. It's inevitable. Fortunately, Albrecht returned safely and unscathed, and also took care of the arrogant French army. The dramatic and repeated reversals of the war situation have left the ruling classes of various countries somewhat confused. King William II of the Netherlands finally breathed a sigh of relief after learning the result. Fortunately, he did not follow the British advice to pursue the Austrian army in the rear, otherwise he would have hit the wall point nearly a week into 1843. The total strength of the German Confederate volunteers in Wallonia and Luxembourg was close to 200,000. The 20,000 French troops before had been completely eaten up, and all the French troops who tried to invade the Franco-Belgian border later were ejected. It seemed that all this was just a ploy by the German Confederacy to lure the enemy in. Fortunately, his lover persuaded him. William II's secret lover, Miss Caroline, also breathed a sigh of relief. She never expected that the German Confederate army would be so desolate. Prussia was truly a shame to the great powers, so the question is, how did this kind of waste destroy his motherland, Poland, in the first place? Franz was also a little confused by the battle situation. How could hundreds of thousands of German Confederate troops be scattered and fled by a mere 20,000 French troops? Could it be that Prussia did this deliberately? But the possibility seemed unlikely. Franz suddenly thought of another possibility. Could it be like Captain Chang's micromanagement during the counter-encirclement and suppression campaign? After several reversals, the Austrian War Ministry was angered. They felt that the French were treacherous and did not deserve the land agreed in advance. Metternich, the master of balance, naturally wanted to smooth things over, present facts and reason, and explain the strength of the French army and the importance of France in this crisis. Count Korolov, the financial steward, admitted that Austria needed France, but this time the loss was so great that the French had to pay a price. Albrecht, who returned victoriously, gave his own opinion. He felt that the French army's robbery in the Walloon region had made it lose its support. It is now entirely possible to decide the ownership of the Wallonia region by voting. At least in comparison, most local people miss the days of the Austrian Netherlands, rather than the civilized France that plundered them crazily. However, this proposal was immediately strongly opposed by Franz. Once Louis Philippe failed to obtain benefits, this local conflict would evolve into a large-scale war. What's more, Russia has not expressed its position yet. Austria, which is located in the center of the European continent, cannot afford to take this risk, but its intention to claim Namur or neutralize it can be considered. And the local people who have just experienced the war will definitely agree with this approach. In addition, Austria could provide land and other types of help to Belgians who did not want to be French. They can choose to settle in the empire's overseas colonies or other undeveloped lands at will, and the church will go all out to provide relevant conveniences. Although most Belgians in Wallonia speak French, many people actually understand a little German or Dutch. What's more important is that they can be dispersed and distributed to various places. After 10 or 20 years, they will automatically become Austrians at the same time. The French atrocities in Wallonia can be used to make a good article. After all, Britain and France are the so-called beacons of the world at this time, and France does not want to be reversely attracted by other countries to immigrate. This series of reversals also made the people on the other side of the strait feel numb. They first heard that France had a new Napoleon, and then died on the battlefield in the blink of an eye. Paris first claimed to avenge him, but the next day it turned into accusing him of deliberately provoking war and destroying the friendship between France and the German Confederation. Chapter 380 Gizet's downfall. The war gradually died down, and there was no movement from France and the Netherlands. Seeing that the German Confederation was beginning to return home, the Anglo-Saxons across the strait finally couldn't sit still. The latter tried to contact various countries to send representatives to London to attend the aftermath meeting, but failed because no one responded, and the final location was set in Luxembourg. Of course, it would be better if it was in Frankfurt or Vienna. After all, it would be a great opportunity to highlight the status of the winner of the German Confederation. But it doesn't matter, because the cake distribution has been basically completed, and all that's left is the final bargaining with France. Because the French violated their previous agreement with the German Confederation, they should be punished. However, neither Austria nor other German states were willing to officially go to war with them, because they were not sure of victory against the behemoth France, so the German-French dividing line was renegotiated. However, for the sake of fairness, the final ownership of Namur province will still be decided by vote. If the locals are willing to stay in France, Germany will never interfere. On the contrary, France must do the same. Senior officials in Paris, including Louis-Philippe and Guizot, felt that the minds of senior officials in Vienna were either broken, or their collective memory was blind, because Wallonia belonged to the French-speaking area. However, what the former did not know was that the local residents had just been plundered by French soldiers, causing almost every household to suffer disaster. Either they lost all their money and food, or their wives and children were separated, and many of the civilian husbands and women who were expropriated never came back. In fact, the reason why people in the Walloon region hate the French so much cannot be just because of the 20,000 French troops. No matter how beastly they are, they cannot harm many people. But the hundreds of thousands of German Confederate troops who were defeated by them were different. The defeated troops were bandits. This sentence was true in many cases, and in many cases as a result, this land suffered unprecedented brutal looting. Fortunately, the number of German Confederate troops was large enough to rotate. These defeated soldiers who had done bad things no longer wanted to make achievements. They just wanted to find a place where no one was around to stay, so they all embarked on the journey back home. The Walloons could not find the culprits, so they simply placed all the blame on the French. Coupled with incitement from the media and the church, the province of Namur voted almost unanimously to reject the proposal to join France. The people of Hainaut and Brabant, who were about to be assigned to France, also fled. They did not like this kind of ruler who did not care about their life or death. France, Paris, Tuileries Palace. Louis-Philippe was furious. Look at the stupid thing you did. The Austrian envoy personally promised Wallonia to us not long ago, but you, a fool, lost it and let France sacrifice 20,000 excellent soldiers in vain. However, the truth is that Prussia soon discovered that these prisoners of war were a hot potato, and the Austrians gave them trouble rather than trophies. So Prussia released the prisoners of war hastily despite the objections of other states. And they did not want to get into trouble. But trouble will never come to them. Those unarmed prisoners of war who had once caused trouble for one side now faced hundreds of thousands of angry residents of Wallonia. Soon a real-life battle royale was staged in the Walloon region, and only a handful of the remaining soldiers were able to escape back to France. Because among the angry pursuers, there were still some dissatisfied German Confederate soldiers hiding in their hearts. They were also sulking, and had nowhere to vent their anger. Those French officers and soldiers who were lucky enough to return home were not treated well by Paris, and they were just treated as ordinary defeated soldiers. Neither Louis-Philippe nor Guizot were interested in losers. In addition, because their weapons have been confiscated by the German Confederate volunteers, not to mention that losing equipment is a felony. Most of their endings are very miserable. The book returns to its true story, but the British said they would send troops to help. Shouldn't we? It was a good thing that Guizot did not mention Anglia, but the mention of it made Louis-Philippe furious. At that time, the British agreed to let their son be the King of Belgium, but in the end they chose the King of England's son-in-law. Fortunately, he was smart enough to marry his daughter to King B. But his son-in-law failed to live up to his trust, and did not turn to France at all. Not only did the Belgians refuse to join the proposed Franco-Belgian customs union, they even flirted with the Anglo-Saxons all day long. All these things made Louis-Philippe resentful, and at that moment, the Namur that the Austrians stuffed into his throat was gone, which made him even more angry. Tell me, are you a spy sent by the British? He asked angrily. This sentence has been hidden deep in the heart of this monarch until now. The inexplicable results of this war, coupled with the loss of Namur and the loss of 20,000 troops, and the fact that he could have waited for a profit, but ended up losing a good situation. How could he not be upset? Guizot's series of actions clearly seemed to Louis-Philippe to value Britain more than France. However, he misunderstood Guizot. The reason why the latter acted like this all along was because he knew the strength of Britain better than anyone else, and also knew the truth about France's internal weakness under its strong appearance. Therefore, he was afraid that his country would be on the wrong team and trigger dozens of attacks again. The crisis of intervention by various countries years ago. Your Majesty, I remain loyal to you and to Great France. You should know that we cannot afford any defeat now. That's enough. Without your stupid actions in private, there would not be today's defeat. Look at what you have done. Are you still embarrassed to deny it? It is because of you that I'm the first citizen. I'm ashamed. Historically, Louis Philippe was nicknamed the Pear King by a wandering painter because his head was big and his face was like a pear. However, he himself preferred to be called the Citizen King or First Citizen. Everything I do is for France, I swear to God. Haha, dear Gizzard, I'm afraid money is your god, right? Louis Philippe sneered. He has lost patience. France is now facing unprecedented changes. Neither the former Kingdom of France nor the Napoleonic Empire could reasonably develop overseas colonies, and now Louis Philippe firmly believes that he has figured out the password to dominance. If every colony can be like Texas, he can recreate countless large and small Frances. Maybe one France can't rule the world or defeat Britain, but 2, 3, what about 4? Texas, Algeria, Morocco, Guatemala, La Plata. These lands are full of great potential. Your Majesty the King, I feel that wealth not only makes people free, but also makes them smart. When our citizens are no longer driven by the damn blind fighting spirit, then a broad road to prosperity will open. There is nothing wrong with wealth. Okay. Even if you get to sit here and give me orders today. To be honest, Gizzard and Louis Philippe were both puppets brought to the stage by financial capitalists. Of course, the latter was nominally the master and the former was the minister. Gizzard's implication was that Louis Philippe had no right to accuse him, but the latter didn't think so. Louis Philippe never defined himself as a pawn point in his eyes. He is the chess player, and the group of financial capitalists are just his supporters. People who want to get rewards and are optimistic about him. Mr. Gizzard, in the name of the first citizen of the Kingdom of France, I solemnly declare that you have been dismissed from office. However, from now on, although you are no longer a member of the cabinet, you are still an official of France. I now give you a brand new task. Governor of Guatemala, please take office immediately. After hearing this, Gizzard walked out of the king's study without saying a word. Although Louis Philippe admitted that Gizzard had certain abilities, his almost flattering policy towards Britain caused France to continue to suffer losses. This is the real reason why he kicked him out of the cabinet. In addition, this is also the result of his expanding ambitions. Historically, Gizzard's diplomatic strategy towards Britain was called traitorous diplomacy, and France made concessions in almost all disputes and conflicts. But France is now stronger than in history and has more conflicts with England. Therefore, Gizzard will naturally be criticized more, and the intensification of conflicts is the biggest factor that makes him step down. Chapter 381 Luxembourg Agreement. January 15, 1843. In the Grand Duke's residence in Luxembourg City, Palmerston, who had never been lonely, suddenly realized that he had become an awkward outsider. Belgium had been divided like a box of exquisite cakes on the dining table. Not only was his presence worthless, but Leopold's objections were deliberately omitted by other attendees. The Dutch took the Flemish territory, but it was seen as due compensation in their eyes. Another neighbor, France, gained the right to protect the downgraded Principality of Belgium, but only the two provinces of Hainaut and Brabant remained under its jurisdiction. Luxembourg regained its lost territory and took back West Luxembourg from Belgium and took back Limburg from the Netherlands and became a constitutional monarchy. It will no longer be controlled by the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but its monarch, William II, will still serve as the Grand Duke. Namur and Liege merged to form the independent Principality of Liege, with the Austrian Emperor also serving as Duke, and they were merged into the German Confederation. In a sense, this also means that Austria will return to the Netherlands again in a few decades. As for the support Palmerston had been expecting from St. Petersburg, which he had hoped for, Tsar Nicholas I, who insisted on orthodox principles, summoned the British ambassador and stated to the latter that he supported the German Confederation in annihilating the products of the revolution and was willing to do so. Decisions to provide force support. Although Russia never sent troops to intervene, the German Confederation generously expressed its willingness to spend 10 million florins to make up for the loss of the Tsar's failure to participate in the war. Of course, this was all discussed by Franz in the name of Archduke Karol. Naturally, the Tsar was very willing to participate in this kind of behavior that was both honorable and honorable. And as far as Nicholas I is concerned, compared with the Anglo-Saxons who have interests first, the unbreakable Holy Alliance is worthy of his trust. After all, this is the most beneficial to the country. Palmerston and other Whitehall lords believed that Britain had never been in this situation, but at this time the entire European continent seemed to be monolithic. Even France, which did not benefit much, did not object to this distribution. Not to mention the so-called allies, the Dutch. Although they did not regain all their homeland this time, the top government officials regarded it as a great victory. Dutch civilians had no interest in the country or the war, but the army and officials took great pleasure in plundering people's wealth when they took over the Flemish region. However, the large number of Catholics made the people very dissatisfied and strongly demanded that the government drive out these guys who were stealing jobs from them. At that time, Dutch civilians naively believed that as long as there were fewer people, they would get more. As for the German Confederation, which has many states, although it has always been a loose alliance, everyone is extremely tight on this matter. Moreover, thanks to the previous battles, Prussia's reputation has fallen to a low point, and it has become the title of the shame of the great powers. Before the military reform, the Prussian army's combat effectiveness was limited. On the other hand, its competitors captured the entire territory of Belgium in just 1 week, and defeated the main force of the French army in 1 day. Their results can be described as glorious. At this time, Austria's reputation was at its peak, and Palmerston knew very well that the old fox Metternich had set up the whole situation, and he was just waiting for Britain to get into it. Why are you carving up innocent Belgium, you bunch of robbers? The domineering diplomat's sensational questioning was interrupted by others before he started. He looked around and saw the representatives of the German Confederation. Prince Metternich looked calm and unmoved. This starts from the liberation of Luxembourg. Those small states also have their own plans. After all, the economic strength of the place is not weak. Although the Netherlands is still its nominal sovereign state at this time, anyone with a discerning eye can see that it is only in name only, and Luxembourg will definitely be merged into a certain country in the future, which will have a major impact on the situation of the German Confederation. As a result, all the states wanted to express themselves. Let the brothers of Luxembourg realize the benefits of joining the Confederation and pave the way for future plans. Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, Hanover and other powerful states almost came to blows over the uneven distribution of the spoils. At this time, the European Prime Minister, who had been staying out of the meeting since the beginning, took the initiative to draw lots to determine the list of final signatories. In the end, this right actually fell into the hands of the Kingdom of Hanover. The German Confederation was actually very dissatisfied with the result of this draw. Because since George, the Elector of Hanover, came to England in 1714, it has been more than 100 years since Hanover, Great Britain and Ireland formed a co-ownership confederacy. Although after the death of King William IV in 1837, the British throne was passed to his niece Victoria, Princess of Kent, who was closely related by blood. Due to the European Continental Salafa law in Germany, which prohibited women from inheriting the throne of Hanover was passed to her fifth uncle, the Duke of Cumberland, known historically as Ernst August I. Although they seem to be separated on the surface, the trade between Hanover and Britain has never been cut off over the years, and the former even refused to join the German customs union because of this. Whether the Hanovers are reliable or not is not yet confirmed within the Confederacy. Moreover, on such an important occasion, the person who wanted to sign was actually a blind man, which made the representatives of the German states even more angry. Georg Friedrich Alexander Karl Ernst August is the current Crown Prince of Hanover. Later Georg V, the famous blind king of Hanover. Georg spent his childhood in Berlin and England. As a child, he lost the vision in one eye due to illness. After an accident in 1833, he lost the other eye and became a veritable blind man. Will a blind prince be able to rule a kingdom in the future? This was the question that Georg and his surrounding people thought about most, but his father Ernst August I insisted on establishing him as his heir and becoming a great king in the future. Historically, Georg V sent troops to defeat the Prussian army during the Austro-Prussian War, and achieved partial victory on the battlefield, but failed to expand the results with the defeat of Austria. Hanover had to choose to surrender, and Georg V could only go into exile overseas, and finally died in a foreign country closer to home. In the venue at this moment, the blind crown prince made a shocking statement. The land in Belgium was originally taken from other countries, and now it is just returned to its original owner. As for banditry, I heard that your ancestors, Lord Palmerston, were engaged in this industry, right? Although Georg's above words are true, they are indeed hurtful. They directly eliminate the legitimacy of the Kingdom of Belgium, and at the same time draw a clear line with its long-term ally, the United Kingdom. Palmerston did not become angry, because he had no hope for this peace conference, because every country seemed to have received benefits, even Prussia, which had made a big mistake this time. Luxembourg directly borders it, and has been stationed by Prussian troops for a long time. It is very likely to merge or join the Prussian side in the future. This will undoubtedly actually enhance the strength of the Prussians. The benefits obtained by Daru are the simplest, but they are more practical. 10 million florins may be looked down upon by other countries, but for the impoverished bear, it is a long lost reign. France, the Netherlands and Austria are also very satisfied with this. If they threaten war at this time, it will only have the opposite effect and make the three countries form an offensive and defensive alliance with the same hatred. But Palmerston was worthy of being one of the most powerful diplomats of the 19th century. He understood that there are no eternal friends, and no eternal enemies, only eternal interests. He believed that time would change everything, and he made a brief speech at the end of the peace meeting. The British Empire refused to sign this contract, and history will prove that today was a mistake. This was a nail planted by Palmerston, and it was also a curse on the peace conference. He believed that interests would lead to changing situations, and one day the Luxembourg Agreement would be broken by the people who made it. Chapter 382. Under the Luxembourg Agreement. The Luxembourg Agreement is as follows. 1. The Kingdom of Belgium was downgraded to the Grand Duchy of Belgium. 2. For example, return the Flemish region to the Netherlands. 3. For example, return Western Luxembourg to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. 4. The Grand Duchy of Belgium is protected by France. 5. The provinces of Namur and Liege, formerly part of Belgium, were merged into the Principality of Liege, with the Austrian Emperor also serving as Duke. Although the British delegation refused to sign the contract, it did not affect the mood of the representatives of other participating countries. After the signing ceremony, a grand dance was held at the Grand Duke's residence in Luxembourg. Britain's diplomatic defeat did not affect Palmerston's mood at the ball. However, the Whigs did not fare so well. This incident directly led to the collapse of Viscount Melbourne's cabinet and the Tories' return to power. This is not the first time Robert Peel has come to power, but his poor personal relationship with the Queen has caused him and his party to experience several serious ups and downs. Fortunately, the confident Whig party got away with it this time. Domestic businessmen paid too high a price for the wonderful post-war interests that this group of politicians painted. If they did not personally launch a war, Britain would probably will fall into another depression like the one in 1837. As mentioned earlier in the book, the UK London stock market crashed due to the US real estate crisis, but the location and object have become two major problems that plague the new cabinet. France, the German Confederation or Russia? Obviously, without reliable allies, it is difficult to face these powerful and difficult enemies alone. The United States may be a good choice, because there has been a territorial dispute between the two sides on the border between Oregon and the United States and Canada. However, as Britain's supplier of cotton raw materials, rashly starting a war with it would affect the interests of many local businessmen, and it would be a waste of money. Unfortunately, before the British were still struggling to find a breakthrough, the economic crisis broke out. The blind mass production of factories caused a surplus of products. Businessmen and capitalists who suffered losses naturally tried to sell their goods at low prices, which indirectly caused the profits of many industries to plummet. It is an unchanging truth that goods do not make money and factories have to lay off people. Since workers have lost their jobs, the capacity of the market for consumption has been reduced to a large extent. This vicious cycle is not the first time for Britain. As a rule, it will be experienced almost every 5 to 10 years. Kingdom of Prussia, Berlin. This joint operation in the lowlands gave Prussian officers a deep appreciation of the horrors of railway transportation. Assuming that the enemy we face is not France but Austria. The latter's soldiers and supplies will be continuously transported to any point on the Prussian-Austrian border through the internal line, and it is not uncommon to even directly attack the city of Berlin. In order to avoid being robbed, Frederick William IV, instigated by a group of junker officers, moved the train station not far from the center of Berlin out of the city, and surrounded it with bunkers and roadblocks, making it look like a train station. A defensive posture. Of course, compared with Prussia, which is relatively broad in depth, the small countries in the German Confederation have no way to find goods. Some kings with severe persecution paranoia even wanted to demolish their own railways to feel at ease. They were afraid that one day groups of troops from Prussia, Austria and other countries would come directly to their door if they disagreed with them. At that time, they could only greet them with white flags. After hearing that the Prussians moved the railway station in the center of their capital 10 kilometers north, the states within the German Confederation began a vigorous renovation project of the railway station in their capital in the following days. However, several small countries with limited financial resources and military strength chose to lie down. After all, if they have no ability to protect themselves, they might as well make money honestly, right? Of course, this decision of various state governments has brought great inconvenience to their citizens, because the latter need to walk several kilometers more to reach the new station site. But it has also unexpectedly ignited another industry: public carriage. To put it simply, a public carriage can be regarded as the current bus. It is different from the modern taxi, which is expensive and the phenomenon of rip-off is more common. Different from the vulnerable groups that modern people imagine. Almost every coachman carries a pistol or a dagger and other light weapons, because they often have to face homeless people and wild animals that stray into the city. In the early days of urbanization in the 18th and 19th centuries, the probability of encountering a wild animal cannot be ignored. As early as 1662. In history, the famous French mathematician and physicist Blaise Pascal tried operating a stagecoach. He received authorization from Louis XIV to establish a stagecoach company, responsible for the operation of 5 lines. This great scientist set several rules for the public transportation industry across the ages, and people still abide by them today more than 300 years later. 1. The route a vehicle takes from one side to another is fixed. 2. Regardless of the use of the carriage, even if there is no one, the vehicle must depart according to the stipulated time. 3. Each passenger only needs to buy a ticket for himself, and the fare remains unchanged. The remaining 2 have undergone some changes with the development of the times. 4. The round Paris line route is divided into several sections, and you need to pay once for each section. A road section refers to a large section of road, including several stations, which here means transfer. 5. In order to avoid black box trading operations and waste of exchange time, gold is not allowed to be used to pay for tickets. Pascal's stagecoach project was a huge success at first, and it solved some of Paris's traffic congestion problems, but history has never lacked examples of bad money driving out good money. France could have led the trend of the times, just like they beheaded Lavoisier, one of the greatest scientists in human history. During the revolution, Pascal and his company offended the horse racing industry and the so-called elite class by giving commoners the opportunity to ride in carriages like the nobles. Members of the Paris Assembly and nobles insisted on highlighting their privileges and advocated prohibiting soldiers, retainers, servants and other inferior attendants from enjoying the same treatment as those above. Since then, public carriages in Paris have lost a large part of their passenger base, and the reduction in passenger traffic has forced them to continue operating by raising fares. This went against the original intentions of its founders and made this form of public transport increasingly unpopular. Eventually, Pascal's stagecoach disappeared around 1677. It was not until 1828 that Paris and London, the two largest cities in Europe, had to openly seek solutions from society in order to solve the increasingly serious problem of urban traffic congestion. Pascal's plan 200 years ago was proposed again, and the public carriage returned to people's attention. However, in the large cities of the German Confederation, including Berlin, Munich and Dresden, public transportation still relied on walking and taxis. As a European city after Paris and London, Vienna is not included in this list. In a sense, this war promoted the development of public transportation in Germany. Although the public carriage was an outdated means of transportation in Franz's eyes, there was really no substitute for it in a short period of time. However, it is not difficult to make Austrian carriages more competitive. After all, rubber tires are obviously much more advanced than the wooden tires commonly seen in streets and alleys at present. Solid rubber tires are still expensive and high-end goods, and only nobles from various countries can afford them. Developing pneumatic tires was not a difficult task for Franz and his scientific team. With the empire's current industrial strength, it is still very easy to produce pneumatic rubber tires. However, in order to minimize waste and also dominate the market, under Franz's proposal, the world's first pneumatic rubber tire company Michelin came out. That's right. Go the way of the French and leave them with nowhere to go. Michelin is a French brand. Chapter 383 Pride and Prejudice. January 13th, 1843. Austria Vienna. The advantages of railways are obvious, while the disadvantages of lack of railways are constantly magnified, as if under a magnifying glass. For example, when the German Confederate Volunteer Army went to Luxembourg not long ago, the Hungarian government openly offered to send troops to rescue Austria in exchange for acquiring the latter to provide 200 million florins in military expenses and to granted a 5-year tax exemption. The Magyar envoy who delivered the letter confidently read out Hungary's written opinions, which was simply unbelievable to the senior officials and generals of the empire who were preparing to gather together for a celebration banquet. They have mixed feelings in their hearts. The news about this country within a country has been blocked to such a terrible extent. They don't know whether they should feel happy or sad. Seeing the surprised eyes on the other side, the envoy felt confused. Could it be that Austria thought it could defeat the French with its own strength, or with the stragglers of the German Confederation? After some brief thinking, Earl Andrew made a bold decision. You must know that there are 180,000 Hungarians among the 420,000 Imperial soldiers. The Magyars regard all the peoples in the territory of the Crown of St. Stephen as Hungarians or their property. The regions including Croatia and Slovakia are important sources of troops for the empire. The reason is simple. These places are poor. There is an old saying in the East that goes, a good man is not a soldier, and a good man is not a soldier. It is similar in the West. Since the Austrians don't need them as allies, what about as enemies? At this time of ebb and flow, Count Andrew did not think that Vienna could withstand the joint attack from Hungary and France. Your Highnesses, Prince Metternich, and ministers, I think you all know the strength of our Magyars very well. Regardless of any conflict, the wiser party will choose not to actively antagonize the kingdom. At least they will not want us to be attracted by our opponents, and we also ask you to seriously consider our proposal. However, Count Andrew was interrupted by Archduke Albrecht before he finished his speech. He was shocked by the other party's arrogant and stupid suggestion. Having participated in the rescue of Hungarian immigrants, he knew very well how ridiculous the so-called Hungarian government was. The Hungarian immigration incident. This is the previous plot. In the name of saving disaster victims, Hungary immigrated refugees to the Americas to relieve local pressure, but in fact, sold them into slavery. Are you serious, Earl? Andrew was very dissatisfied with the young man interrupting him, but since the other party had already fallen into the trap, he mercifully summarized the current situation. Of course, as far as I know, Archduke Albrecht, the most outstanding general among the younger generation of the royal family, has been besieged by the French and Flemish. The so-called German Confederate Volunteer Army was nothing more than a disorganized group with different agendas, so it was defeated by the French army. This comes as no surprise. We Hungarians are completely different. Each of us is a noble warrior. Also IMHO, it seems like I've never met you. May I ask who you are? Archduke Albrecht glanced at the other party with disdain. Friedrich. Ferdinand Leopold. When these words came out, Archduke Friedrich became unhappy and thought to himself, you, a bushy-eyed guy, have learned how to lie. Sure enough, you are like this. After hanging out with that kid for a long time, however, he did not expose his eldest brother, and the other distinguished guests in the room had the mentality of watching the show. They were all curious about what kind of medicine the uninvited guest was selling and the good point Erlandru said and then said nothing, which made the surrounding audiences disappointed point. Although this person has an arrogant expression on his face almost every time he goes to Vienna, in fact he neither understands nor takes it seriously, which is why he is so ignorant in public today. Royal Duke's joke. Count, I accept your wishes. Why don't you take a break first? The Imperial Regency Council will discuss the matter. Once a decision is made, you will be notified immediately. Prince Metternich politely gave the eviction order, although this Magyar envoy is ignorant, given that Outer-Litania is too large and has a deep connection with Nelitania. This diplomatic master still hopes to deal with the problem through peaceful means. Of course, military means are not impossible to choose from, but considering that as the empire grows, the conflicts with its former allies, the British, are gradually deepening. And the Serbs in the south are also restless. The attitudes of Russia and the Ottomans are still unknown, so it is not worth the effort to take this risk. You are joking, Prince. I have not booked a hotel yet, said Count Andrew. Go and help Lord Andrew book a room in the best hotel in Vienna. Count Korolov ordered the person next to him. I'm sorry to waste your kindness, but I don't want to stay in this city for too long. I don't like the air here. Erlandru sighed in disgust. What do you mean? Please give me an answer immediately, otherwise I will truthfully inform our parliament that my trip to Vienna will be empty-handed. Facing another naked threat from Count Andrew, the guests around him could not sit still, except for the two royal nobles present, Archduke Louis and Archduke Franz Karol. Metternich was the only one who remained calm. Watching idly point, Archduke Louis was studying porcelain, and Archduke Franz Karol was feeding seals wine. In that case, please do as you please, Count Korolov said decisively. He was not interested in arguing with the provocateur in front of him. If it weren't for the upcoming negotiation, he really wanted to humiliate the other party. I will come back. Erlandru left these words and walked away. What an idiot, Count Latter said first. He had long been dissatisfied with the behavior of the Magyars, and the military had always been the most powerful war faction. After saying that, he laughed loudly, but he was greeted with strange looks from the people around him. Okay, Latter, this is not funny. The Kingdom of Hungary is our ally, Count Korolov reminded point, but the former obviously didn't understand the meaning, and said it to himself. Once the negotiations are over, we should send troops to question them properly. Got, why are you so naive like those warlike junkers? Although I know nothing about marching and fighting, how can I repeat this quick victory without the advantage of railway transportation? You should know that there are too many unstable factors and potential crises inside and outside the empire. Once the civil war starts, it is bound to be a protracted tug-of-war. By then, I'm afraid that all kinds of monsters and monsters who usually hide too deeply will appear, and it will be too late to end the war. In fact, everyone present knew that the Hungarian issue was like the sword of Damocles hanging over the empire's head. Sooner or later, it would be wielded. Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was not surprised by the Hungarians' actions. First of all, because of the information gap, the two sides were not at the same starting line point, and Franz bought the big nobles, land, money, power. Written in the previous chapter, these Hungarians living in Vienna are no longer the same species as the Hungarians living under the territory of St. Stephen's Crown. At least they thought so. So not only did no one tell Erlandru the truth, they also told him wrong information. Secondly, Hungary is still essentially a parliamentary political system. Even if some smart people discovered the problem, they were unable to stop the flood. On the contrary, as opponents, they will be regarded as aliens and despised by their own people. In the end, arrogance blinded Hungarians from seeing this ever-changing world. The 19th century happened to be the era of the most dramatic changes. Chapter 384 Telegram. Austria Vienna. Franz had never known that the information gap could be so terrible. Looking at the Hungarian intelligence network and thinking about the Russians' response speed, it makes people cry. In fact, Vienna had already set up the most rudimentary telegraph lines at this time, but they were only connected to a few places and had very limited use. Contrary to most people's impressions, Morse was not the first to invent the telegraph, and he did not even make the first telegraph machine. 10 years ago. Gauss, known as the king of mathematics, and Weber, the German scientist who first made an ammeter, began to try to develop an electromagnetic telegraph, and specially set up a telegraph line between their laboratories 2 years later. In 1835, Russian diplomat Schillinger's telegraph machine came out. 4 years later, William Thurgill Cook, a retired British officer, and Wheatstone, a professor of natural philosophy at the London College of Economics, collaborated to make a 5-hand telegraph that was first used at Paddington Station in London with West, used on the railway line between Drayton, a distance of approximately 21 kilometers. For now, the Morse telegraph machine cannot be called early at all. At first, the toys of Gauss and William Edward Weber were generally not favored by the world, who believed that they had no practical value. The reason is simple. The very primitive electric wires and exposed metal wires at that time could not withstand wind and sun, and underground pipes could not be laid because they were not corrosion resistant. However, the problem in the eyes of these two geniuses is very easy to solve in the eyes of Franz's team. As a result, the world's earliest rubber-coated insulated wire was born. However, because he rarely had the opportunity to travel far before this, he did not fully understand the role of the telegraph system until now. Moreover, the raw material rubber is a scarce resource in Austria. In the mid-19th century, the entire world's rubber supply was choked by Brazilians affected by the Brazilian Civil War not long ago. Its trade volume fluctuated greatly, became very unstable. At the same time, in view of the large number of orders from the army and the unpredictable world situation, Franz also used rubber more where he could make quick money. Today's huge empire only has a few very simple telegraph lines, which is very inconsistent with its status as a great power. Therefore, it is extremely necessary to speed up its construction process. The telegraph machine designed by Gauss and Weber has become very good after continuous improvement, but these two geniuses' understanding of compilation is too advanced, even to the point that it is difficult for ordinary people to understand. The two of them can only communicate in a way that they can understand. It is not a problem for wizards, but it is really difficult for ordinary people to understand. Because the minimum requirement to operate this type of telegraph was a college graduate. This greatly limited its popularity. As the saying goes, there are specialties in a profession, and professional matters should be left to specialists. It happened that the world's first programmer, Ada Lovelace, the daughter of the British poet Byron, was close at hand, so Franz came to Babbage's studio with the telegraph in his hand. As soon as I entered the door, I saw a human-shaped meat mountain. Mr. Babbage, you seem to be getting fatter than before. Roseanne barely squeezed out 2 eyes on his fat face and took off his hat respectfully. Your Highness the Grand Duke, I'm little Babbage. My father is still in the laboratory. An embarrassed look suddenly appeared on Franz's face. He never expected that little Babbage would follow in his father's footsteps. Yes, I have heard of you. Last year you graduated with first place from the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Vienna. You are indeed like your father. Thank you for your compliment. Please forgive my rudeness. I need to rush to the cafeteria, so I won't stay with you much longer. I think there is a girl who may like me. She always makes delicious food for me. A Jenny subconsciously looked at little Babbage's appearance and managed to hold back her smile. Franz smiled and nodded. He hoped that it was not Babbage's illusion. After all, when it comes to talents, the more the merrier, the better. Perhaps the inventions of these scientific masters have not yet shown their effect, and they are even funny. But as technology continues to expand and advance, they will eventually prove their worth. Not to mention someone like him who has a cross-generational vision to help point. After passing through a narrow passage, Franz finally arrived at Babbage's laboratory point. Unlike the messy outside, the inside of the laboratory looks extremely tidy, with all the utensils, equipment and books neatly placed on the shelves like an obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm afraid the only flaw is that the average weight of the entire room, including assistants, is at least 120 kilograms. The huge machine composed of countless gears in front of me is the Trinity analytical engine that Babbage is studying. The assistants are carefully checking the placement and precision of each gear. Mr. Babbage, I would like to ask Miss Ada and you to do me a favor. Old Babbage was quite familiar with Archduke Franz's voice. After all, few people here could talk to him in English. Your Highness, please wait a moment. After saying that, he turned to the assistant below and shouted, "Put me down quickly." Several assistants immediately shook the lever below, and the height of the elevated chair, where old Babbage was sitting, was slowly lowering. Miss Ada also walked out of a nearby room. Her eyes were bloodshot and her hair had become much thinner. It seems that the high salt, high sugar, lack of vegetables diet coupled with long-term mental work has left her body overwhelmed. Your Highness, what do you want from us? Old Babbage asked. I need a telegraph code that is easier to understand. Before he could say anything, Franz went straight to the point. After that, the staff present started to get busy. The people who work on the analytical engine are mechanical engineering experts. They all agreed that the telegraph was an invention that could change the world. However, Babbage Sr. was on another level. He was vaguely aware that the telegraph would be a great help to his analytical engine. Some new ideas have emerged in this Frankenstein's head, but first it may be necessary to overturn all the previous progress. This obviously requires great courage and courage. On the other hand, under the auspices of Ada, the compilation of telegraph codes progressed very smoothly. Compared with the complexity of the analytical engine, the telegraph was like a child's toy. Soon a very simple telegraph code was codified. This type of telegraph code only requires simple understanding and can be actually operated. It is simple, clear and has little ambiguity. This greatly accelerated the development of telegraphy. It's just that at this time, the United States, far across the ocean, began to have the idea of collecting patent fees. Of course, Americans' rights protection would have to wait until decades later. In addition to the above mentioned simple telegram for civilian use, Franz also started secret research on a complex military version in advance. After all, today's communication methods such as carrier pigeons, stagecoaches, dogs, and beacons are really unable to keep up with the times. Although radio technology is still far away from the present, the role of telegraph in homeland defense cannot be underestimated. After all, the information gap in this era is too terrifying, and the current European battlefield is not like the wars of later generations. Surrender is actually not shameful, and is even commonplace for some soldiers. However, the Prussians were very clumsy in handling the surrendered French prisoners of war. Perhaps out of fear of future revenge from the powerful French, the former did not even dare to ask for ransom from the latter. However, the hesitation and weakness of the Prussians accidentally caused another tragedy. Although a considerable number of French soldiers were captured and killed by local Walloon victims, but from the perspective of Paris, this is an excellent opportunity to discredit the opponent, and may also cause some unnecessary trouble to Austria and the entire German Confederation in future battles. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 385, The Principality of Liege. The Principality of Liege. Although it didn't last long, the local residents obviously adapted to the new identity of Austrians relatively quickly. After all, they were very experienced, so there was no resistance. On the contrary, they were overjoyed to be able to join the broader market of the German Confederation. Even though the locals usually communicate in French, it does not hinder their interest in learning another language. Soon, Austrian language schools, German, were popping up all over the Liege and Namur regions. Of course, knowing French is not a bad thing. At that time, almost everyone in the German aristocracy could communicate in French, which was very useful in some business situations. Although the French have explicitly restricted trade between local residents and the Principality of Belgium, detours are always more difficult than difficult. What's more, according to news from Vienna, Austria is ready to start building a railway in the Principality of Liege to connect important cities in the territory with each other. Most of the appointed government officials of the principality are locals, and they are basically only responsible for taxation, and do not care about politics. The Principality of Liege express great satisfaction with this. However, Austria seems to have no interest in sending troops to the area, and seems to intend to entrust Prussia to continue to assume the responsibility of defending the territory. This move was immediately unacceptable to the Principality of Liege. At any rate, the troops under Archduke Albrecht were relatively well disciplined, but the rest of the German Confederate armies were not even as good as the French. A group of robbers who can't do anything, but they are also a group of bandits who do it by themselves, and have enough food and clothing. In order to ensure their own safety, the nobles and businessmen in the Liege area immediately decided to invest in the establishment of their own militia. In fact, similar groups were not uncommon at the time, but the fact that an enclave had its own army was unacceptable to the officials in Vienna. If they own the money and the military, wouldn't they become a state within a state again? Count Latter was obviously insinuating. How could he be indifferent to this, when he couldn't even stand the behavior and attitude of the Magyars? That's easy. We can send a team of officers there to lead them, a minister said casually. But as soon as he spoke, he was scolded by Count Korolaf. You damn idiot. Do you think you can control the situation by sending a few officers? Whose soldiers are eating and using them? They know better than you. Everyone, please calm down and listen to me. I think it is a top priority to send troops to garrison there as soon as possible. Metternich said calmly. He naturally understood the meaning of his old rival's words. And the word militia has always associated Metternich with the French Revolution. Therefore, he felt that the militia group composed of Liege people was not reliable. If he wanted to stabilize the situation, he needed to mobilize troops from the country first. Historically, the Habsburg family has always done this, recruiting a group of soldiers from within, and then recruiting a group of mercenaries locally. At the same time, he won over the merchants and nobles to stand on the same side as himself. So, according to your suggestion, how much should I send? Hundreds? Thousands? Or tens of thousands? A new problem has arisen. That is, if there are too few soldiers, we cannot defend it, and if there are too many soldiers, we will not be able to make ends meet. Franz, who was not present, thought that this situation was not too difficult to deal with, and he only needed to maintain a small and capable army. The salaries of the militiamen must be paid uniformly by the empire, and the officers must be selected and appointed by the state. Local citizens can get the opportunity to serve as officers, but they must go through the process of furthering their studies in Austria. At the same time, the empire encouraged merchants and nobles to donate to the garrison in exchange for promises that those who fulfilled the agreement would receive official positions and noble status, but they would not be able to hold official positions locally. The reason is that the Principality of Liege is close to France. Although its terrain advantage is easy to defend and difficult to attack, it is obviously impossible to stop a powerful country with just one fortress. Moreover, with the development of railways, the speed of troop transportation has greatly accelerated. As long as the local troops can withstand it for a few days, they can get a lot of reinforcement and supplements at the same time. Compared with garrison defense, strengthening intelligence penetration work is the only way to solve local defense. If the enemy's offensive intentions can be known in advance, the empire can make strategic decisions in advance. Therefore, building railways is more important than garrisoning. From a global perspective, the Principality of Liege may be invaded by the four bordering countries, namely France and France. The Principality of Belgium is considered a vassal. If the opponent is France, then Austria can completely use the power of the German Confederation and railway lines to send troops to the front line, and at the same time use Italy, Baden and other places to attack the French mainland. But considering that the current conflict between Austria and France is not big, on the contrary, both countries have to deal with the suppression of the British. To a certain extent, it can even be said to be sympathetic point. Even if a war breaks out in the future, the battlefield will be chosen in Italy, otherwise the French will face the wrath of more than just Austria. Point. If the opponent were replaced by Prussia, it would be equivalent to a full-scale civil war in the German Confederation. In this case, the strategic importance of the Principality of Liege is irrelevant, because the decisive battlefield will be fought in the area between Prussia and Austria. This possibility is the greatest. After all, it is inevitable that Prussia and Austria will clash over the leadership of the German region. Next is the Netherlands. Compared with the first two heavyweight countries, the Dutch's military strength can barely threaten the Principality of Liege, but it has no reason to take this path, because it is a way to kill 100 enemies and lose 10,000 active suicide. The same goes for Luxembourg and the Netherlands. Even since Albrecht led the Austrian army to liberate the area not long ago, the locals may not be able to accept this whimsical approach. Naturally, Franz's advice came from his father, who had recently raised a pet seal. His proposal was very good for the royal family. In short, as long as we can collect more taxes and spend less, the empire does not lack a so-called enclave. Of course, he himself is not interested in enclaves, but politics is not determined by one person's preferences. If Austria does not get any real benefits or only reputation after the war this time, the people and the aristocracy will not agree. Most people don't care about so-called fame or political benefits. They pay more attention to cost-effective benefits. For example, the empire's acquisition of new territories can immerse the people in joy, which is a simple patriotic enthusiasm. Although they didn't understand the real meaning behind it, everyone's face was filled with happy smiles. Franz knew very well that the current time was not suitable for preaching, and it was right to celebrate to the fullest. Therefore, under his operation, all products of the royal family stepped up promotions within a month. However, this method was still beyond the scope of people's understanding in this era. They did not understand that this was a commercial method and instead caused chaos in the city. Since the royal family took the lead, other merchants had to follow. Domestic consumption in Austria has increased sharply during this period, and even citizens from some neighboring countries have heard the news and come here. After all, it is a common human trait to like high quality and cheap goods, and it does not seem easy for Austrians to win the war in the end. People felt the benefits and businessmen made money. The empire has also weakened the impact of Britain's trade dumping on the European continent to a certain extent, and its own superficial data such as taxation and fiscal revenue have also become very good looking. What's more worth mentioning is that the former is also the only country that has remained strong during this small economic crisis. This has given hope to many people at home and abroad, and more residents from the German region are willing to live in Austria. It is human nature to be strong, and a prosperous and powerful country is even more desirable. Chapter 386. Moving forward. Prussia, Pomerania. The stone walls that Mr. Otto organized the local people to build did not have any effect. The Russians did not arrive, and the war did not happen. He himself won the title of Defender of Pomerania. Of course, Bismarck didn't care what others thought. He was both happy and relieved that the situation did not develop in a bad direction. This was enough. However, the poor performance of the Prussian army in Namur really disappointed him. He couldn't understand how incompetent the command was that led to the defeat of more than 100,000 troops by 20,000 French troops, with the main force still being blocked in the city. Not only did this operation to send troops to Luxembourg achieve nothing, it also caused a huge scandal. This was a big loss to Prussia's international prestige, and in the end it had to give in on the issue of the ownership of the Principality of Liege. In Bismarck's view, this was Prussia's only gain. The Austrians were once again pushed to the front line to face the threat of the French. It is feasible to use the contradictions between France and Austria to seek benefits for the kingdom, but doing so will undoubtedly arouse the resentment of other countries in the Confederation. However, if you want to lead Germany, you will have to deal with those small states sooner or later. This does not seem to be important. Mr. Otto was thinking rapidly in his mind as a group of laborers moved a large amount of goods into the mansion. Be gentle, be gentle. This is from Vienna. It's very valuable. Yes, Bismarck also joined the hunt for goods in Austria. Although his identity as a patriot made him reject this huge southern neighbor, he could not do without its goods. What's more, the sales of Austrian products in Prussia are very tight. This time the prices have been reduced, and the junker nobles who have the strength and warehouses have hoarded a large amount of goods. They believe that once the Austrian promotion ends, the items will return to their original prices and they can make a profit. After Bismarck decided to sell these items, he decided to spend some of his savings on a trip to Paris. Curiosity drove him to see the world, see the world's largest city up close, and see the hometowns of wise men such as Rousseau, Montesquieu and Voltaire. At this time, French culture represented by Paris was still sought after by the world. But as a butterfly flutters, something slightly changes at the crossroads of history. Vienna and Paris are both recognized as the only two metropolises on the European continent, and in terms of academic atmosphere and artistic atmosphere alone, the former surpasses the latter. But Otto of Pomerania visited Vienna once as a humble member of the Prussian mission, and this exquisite city left a mixed impression on him. It is magnificent and prosperous, but it lacks the majesty of the capital of a country. It's hard to be in awe of those exquisite buildings and the overwhelming sounds floating everywhere. In the previous plot, Bismarck visited Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz has no comment on Eugenia's assassination proposal. Count Andrew is just a small figure, and his life and death have little impact on the overall situation. Translatania is almost out of touch with Nelitania. When the Zagreb and Sibiu lines are opened, it will become a complete state within a state. Zagreb is the central city of Croatia. The Zagreb line is the southern line around Hungary. The northern Bukovina line has been completed, and the remaining line is the eastern Sibiu line. Some people must ask why there is no western front. Because the west is the Austrian mainland. Franz reviewed documents on recent domestic product pre-sales, and found that beer sales were so far ahead that they might threaten food security. Fortunately, the agricultural products that the UK was busy selling finally reached its own hands. It's just that the price is not as good as what they paid for it. Franz, who was prepared for a rainy day, also purchased a batch of grain in the name of his country's church and smuggled it to the island of Ireland to deal with possible crises. In addition, the church is also working intensively to secretly transport religious talents to the local area. At this time, there are only more than 100 Catholic churches on the island of Ireland, and as many as 100 of them have been infiltrated. In fact, these clergymen sent to Ireland did not know what their specific tasks were. They were only told to deal with possible disasters. It is too sacred to sacrifice hundreds or even thousands of people for years because of an uncertain prophecy. Of course, only believers can do this kind of thing. Most of the priests felt that the so-called scourge in the prophecy was poverty, because most of them came from the wealthy areas of Austria. Although poor people live in the streets all over the world, the poverty of the Irish people is still beyond their imagination. They have no beds, no quilts, only straw, and those houses are simpler than stables. Those sour potatoes are only suitable for feeding pigs in our country, and the paste mixed with grass seeds and bark makes my throat feel like a knife. It hurts just like cutting. It's hard to imagine that a nation can live so tenaciously and humbly. This is a cultural desert. Almost no one can read. They say they believe in God, but they don't know the content of the Bible. The Irish had no land, and almost all the land belonged to outsiders and their servants. People here sleep all day long. But unlike what the British say, they are not lazy. They just have to save energy in order to survive. Such was the feeling of the first Austrian priests to arrive in Ireland. These clergy received gifts from well-wishers, but they didn't quite know what to do with them. Some people choose to sell the grain and use the money earned to build a school in the parish, because he believes that knowledge is power, and learning can make you rich. Some people bought land from landowners and gave it to the Irish for farming, charging only a small amount of rent to support church expenses. Soon they encountered a problem, which was that it aroused the vigilance of some British people, and some even created and spread rumors. Those Catholics are buying the Irish with land and they want to kill us all. Protestants/Anglicans. This Rumor has been popular in the United States several times in history, and each time it caused a large-scale humanitarian crisis in the end. The priests had to return the land to the British landlords in order to save the church, and then the matter was suppressed. Point of course, some people realize that purchasing land and building schools are too troublesome, and it is difficult for ordinary believers to feel the mercy of God. The solution of this group of benefactors is to directly make the food into the sacrament and distribute it to all believers who come to worship. In order to prevent the precious food from rotting after being left for a long time, some thoughtful priests simply went to the village to distribute the Holy Communion directly. Within a short time the church became lively and even many well-dressed people came to share Holy Communion. The priests were relatively satisfied with their missionary results, but soon after the distribution of Holy Communion ended, the church was once again filled with poor people. All their efforts seemed to be in vain. Some priests did the opposite. Since hoarding food was the most effective way to deal with disasters, why not do it? The activists said they would do it immediately, and the organizers began to dig a cellar under the church to store food in case of emergency. These people live an extremely poor life and are called misers by their peers. Of course, there are also many decent gentlemen who are not used to living a poor life. After leaving the country, they became wanton due to the lack of supervision and control. Greedy and addicted to enjoyment, they not only regarded selling food as a business to make money, but even got a line with the British and betrayed information about the Austrian church. Of course, because no valuable information was extracted from them, the British no longer bothered to deal with these spineless and worthless guys. Chapter 387 Overture. February 1843, the prelude to Spring. A sailing merchant ship loaded with boxes of smelly cargo landed in the port of London. The businessman who was waiting to book them couldn't help but yell, "Damn it! Who are you going to let me sell these stinky things to?" The captain wiped the saliva that had splashed on his face, took out a pipe, and took a puff. The smoke ring he exhaled immediately made the other party cough repeatedly. "That's none of my business. I didn't come all the way from the Yankees to get this stuff to you just to hear your complaints." "What did you say?" the businessman asked loudly. "Listen, I have no interest or leisure in interfering in your private affairs, but the contract made cannot be denied. It is only natural to pay according to the goods." The captain said solemnly every word. "Take your smelly things and disappear from here immediately. You can't even take a penny. Otherwise, you will suffer a lot." The other party shouted, "Do you want to default on your debt? Your contract is jointly recognized by the United States and Britain." The captain, who is engaged in the transportation of ocean-going trade commodities, has experienced many battles and has seen a lot. Once these merchants cannot sell their goods, they deliberately find excuses to make things difficult and try every means to deny or reject them so as to reduce their own losses. But the captain has been doing this business for many years and has never seen any big storms or waves. After a wink behind him, several sailors quickly surrounded him, squeezing the businessman in the middle. At this time, the latter also realized that something was wrong, and he quickly shouted, "What do you want to do? You can't afford to offend the forces behind me." As soon as he finished speaking, the agile captain took out an awl and put it against his throat. "I don't have time to talk nonsense with you. Listen up, there are only two options. Either give me money or let your friends collect the body. You win, you damn vampire." The businessman tremblingly took out the check and cursed, while the captain, who had just successfully intimidated the other party, looked indifferent. "Both the Bank of England and the Rothschild Bank are fine, but if it's a check, I'm afraid you'll have to come with us." Looking at the stinking grains piled up under the scorching sun, the businessman sitting on the dock felt like crying. Originally he owned several factories, but when he heard that there might be a large-scale war in Europe, he would definitely make money by hoarding food. He quickly sold his products and even borrowed a lot of money from relatives and friends, and finally purchased a large amount of agricultural products from the other side of the ocean. However, the rumored all-out war did not come, and the European continent was still welcoming a bumper harvest. He made the wrong judgment and could only swallow the bitter pill and dispose of the hoarded goods at a low price. After all, the date for repayment is getting closer and closer. If he misses a date, the interest generated will weigh him down for the rest of his life. But nowadays, Europeans are not interested in moldy grains, and the British are even less likely to buy them. It seems that they can only be sold to Ireland. At that time, the Irish were not Europeans in the eyes of the Anglo-Saxons, nor were they even white. They just looked similar to white people, just like the difference between Native Americans and Indians previously. A businessman from England was trying every means to lower the purchase price of grain, while the American businessman on the other side was trying every means to sell the low quality similar goods he had hoarded. Eventually they struck a deal. The British got the price they wanted, and the Americans were able to clear out their overstocked inventory. A box of grain with deadly germs in Boston Harbor will be sent from here to Great Britain, and then to Ireland, where it will trigger a huge disaster that will kill millions of people. A few years later, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Tobacco has been introduced to Europe since the 16th century, but its original use was not for pleasure, but to treat headaches. Later, people discovered that it can not only treat headaches, but also refresh and suppress other pain disorders. British doctors regarded it as a miracle cure-all, just like laudanum. A few hundred years later, on this day in 1843, France brought paper cigarettes to the market. However, the product did not create a sensation. On the contrary, the company that had high hopes for it went bankrupt a few years later. The original target users of this kind of cigarette were women, just like the watch, because men at that time preferred pipes, which could show their identity and status. But it's a pity that not many women smoked at that time. In fact, not only women, but also the proportion of men smoking is very low. However, the former will also use high-end pipes to show their charm. However, in this era, just like high heels, they are usually only favored by prostitutes. Franz ordered people to conduct an investigation. Due to a certain rumor, smoking was banned in public places in the Imperial capital. It seems that only Bohemia and northern Italy have a greater demand for tobacco, and they should be relatively wealthy as the locals' life-related. The prospects for tobacco consumption in Germany are not ideal either. The market in France is good, but the threshold is too high, and it may be difficult to enter. In fact, Spain, the Netherlands, and Portugal in Western Europe are all major tobacco consumers. However, except for the Netherlands, the above-mentioned countries are all areas that are difficult for Austria to enter. Tobacco consumption in Mexico and the United States is not low, but both countries are all material-producing areas, and they do not follow martial ethics. Therefore, France's tobacco plan can only be postponed. The breaking point to change the situation has been grasped, but there is still no good opportunity. Incidentally, the military love cigarettes that are easy to carry and use. After all, it is not convenient for ordinary soldiers to carry a large pipe when marching and fighting. Franz, what do you think of me training a group of SEALs? Archduke Friedrich said, it depends on the intention. If it's to head the bull, it's definitely not appropriate. He thought of the Navy SEALs at first sight, but that didn't refer to well-trained animals, but to Marines. Of course not. I'm going to let them act as messengers. After all, communication at sea is too inconvenient, especially between fleets, so division of troops is the most taboo in naval battles. And have you ever thought about, even if the training is successful, what is the chance of them catching traces of the fleet in the vast sea? What if they encounter sharks, killer whales and other beasts along the way? To train SEALs, you might as well train some dolphins, killer whales and the like. The IQ is also not low, and he is close to people and easy to train. Franz himself was not optimistic about this project. He knew that this problem could only be solved by radio. Haha, don't underestimate this thing. It's very powerful. Friedrich said as a SEAL weighing more than 80 kilograms knocked him to the ground, rubbed against him, and slapped him fiercely. Friedrich was not well received by animals, and this guy's still ungrown figure was really powerless to fight back against ocean behemoths like seals. Franz threw a fish to the seal, and the beast immediately transformed into a cute beast, and ran to rest in the shade of a tree nearby. I think it's better for you to continue researching your one-shot deal. Although I think battleships are the wrong direction for human naval research, there doesn't seem to be a better choice at this time. How about the rocket speedboat I proposed before? Friedrich wiped his face twice and said, how is it? Very good. If the Barbary pirates still exist, you will definitely become a great hero. But the protection of this small boat is too low, and the range of the rocket is insufficient, so you need to get close to shoot point. The firepower is enough to easily sink a small boat, just like the Barbary pirates who like to join gangs and fight hand to hand. I guess you can blow people up every time point, but battleships are completely different. The opponent only needs to fire grape shot to wipe out everyone on your ship. If a high explosive bomb directly hits the hull or ammunition compartment, you can watch the fireworks show point. Those rockets may be quite effective against infantry and small boats, but they are far from the deterrent you imagine for battleships. Franz thought for a moment and then said, "You mean the lethality is insufficient and the error tolerance is too low, right?" Chapter 388. The number one thug. Intrigues. Inside the Empire's second shipyard, spring is springing outside, and the earth is getting warmer, and the largest ironclad ship in the world is being secretly built here, with its weight expected to exceed 7,000 tons. It is nearly 2,000 tons heavier than the largest sailing battleship today. Historically, it was not until 1852 that the first ironclad ship that exceeded the 6,000 ton mark was ushered in. That was the Wellington, the pride of the United Kingdom, the overlord of the oceans at that time. And Friedrich's goal has always been to surpass Britain and France. In order to reverse the huge numerical disadvantage, he needs a group of capital ships that can pose a huge threat to his opponents. Originally, the risk of building a 7,000-ton battleship was not small. It had both technical difficulties and other challenges. However, due to Austria's rapid progress in steelmaking technology over the past few years, the construction of this very large warship has achieved a major breakthrough from drawing work to final launch point. In fact, the young naval marshal has not really realized that his warships can be made larger and heavier, and even exceeding 10,000 tons is no longer a distant dream. But in fact, given that the current steel quality has not yet reached the standard, the 10,000-ton giant ship simply cannot tap and unleash its full potential and advantages. At this time, the rocket power was insufficient, and the strategy of using small boats to carry cannons also failed to work. Since they are subject to the above restrictions, they can simply build a 7,000-ton ship to force the British to kick off the naval competition in advance and see how the other side will make a move. In retrospect, it may take 6 to 7 years to complete the ship. After all, no one has ever set foot on an ironclad ship of such a tonnage. The price of this ship is expected to be more than 6 million florins, 5 times that of an ordinary battleship. The length of the ship is 85 meters, the width is 20 meters, and the height is 6 meters. The internal structure is similar to that of the later Ingeuan ship, but a new steam turbine is used in the power system. The horsepower can reach more than 15,000 horses, which is twice that of the latter, and the speed is about 21 knots. In terms of speed alone, it can beat any warship in the world today. This record may be difficult to break in the next few decades. However, there are also quite a few flaws. Its firepower and defense design are much worse than those of the Ingeuan ship. The main reason is that the current technology in artillery and armor is still very backward. In addition, at Franz's strong request, the ship also reproduced the ramming horn, a piece of equipment used by ancient warships. In addition, Friedrich also started exploratory research on mines and torpedoes under Franz's repeated suggestions. The technological threshold of these two weapons is not high, but their power is very huge. Although Franz is aware of the development trends of these weapons, the specific applications must be studied by professionals. A real sea battle with the Anglo-Saxons, who started out as pirates and robbers, only exists in the ideal. Even if you want to be Song Xiangang, it does not mean that the other party will follow your ideas. War is to return all human moral bottom lines to zero. In the highest form of violence, kindness is just a means. As the imperial industry continues to expand, the rubber crisis has changed from once a year to once every 6 months. Factories can only operate for a few months each year because raw materials are quickly used up. The Brazilians' promises are as unreliable as their industrial development, and the rubber gaps are as difficult to plug the spilled blood as the broken wounds, and they seem to have nothing to do with the number one thug. Instead of being defeated by the Brazilians, Garibaldi became more and more courageous. Italy has 3 fights of martial virtue. Garibaldi has 5 fights, and everyone in the world owes 2 fights. A comment from a book friend. Garibaldi was once a follower of Mazzini, joined the Carbonari party, participated in the Savoy expedition, and was even chased by the Austrian army. But his experience in South America is legendary. In order to avoid pursuit by Austria, Garibaldi and some Italian expatriates fled to Brazil. Soon they were moved by the spirit of the Farrapos people and joined this vigorous uprising. The Farrapos uprising was an uprising of Republicans in Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, from 1835 to 1846. It was named after the Republicans in southern Brazil who were called Farrapos, meaning poor men. This legendary figure once led 12 soldiers and his Indo-European wife at the mouth of the river to repel a government fleet 10 times their strength. He also captured 7 fortresses in 5 days and killed 11 enemies in one battle. The Brazilian government once offered a bounty of 10,000 crucible, but none of the bounty hunters who took over the business came back alive. Crucible, Brazilian currency at the time. Another time, Garibaldi's ship used up all its cannonballs during the battle. Facing the Brazilian warship, he chose to take the initiative to move closer. As soon as the two sides came into contact, the bullets in the guns were emptied. While the two fighting parties were reloading, Garibaldi picked up an axe and swung it directly to the opposite side with the help of the rope. Under his inspiration, his own crew members jumped to join the enemy ship one after another. In the ensuing battle, a heroic man wielding an axe killed everyone on the Brazilian warship. As awe-inspiring as a ghost. The most dangerous one was in a tavern, where 5 gunmen surrounded Garibaldi and his wife, but in the end people only found a mess there. Soon after, the couple reappeared on the battlefield. No one knows what happened, but he has been confirmed as the #1 thug. But in fact, the activity of this #1 thug has not fundamentally reversed the situation between the two parties. The Brazilian government's military power is still strong. Coupled with Austria's loans, a large number of soldiers were recruited and sent to the front line continuously, along with boxes after boxes of weapons shipped from the former's homeland. On the other hand, the areas occupied by the rebels have no access to the sea, lack of industry, complex terrain, and harsh environment. Even agriculture is difficult to be self-sufficient. Coupled with the destruction of the war, even if they win consecutive battles at this time, they are unable to provide food and clothing for everyone needs. Of course, if they defend according to danger, the rebels will not have a problem holding on for a few more years. But General Canabero had been dazzled by the victory, and he wanted to have a decisive battle with the government troops on the plains. But this is not the only factor. In the final analysis, it is insufficient supplies. As the rebels occupied more and more areas, more and more Fabians joined their ranks. Rather than thinking that they are here to liberate Brazil, these poor people are more likely to think that they are here to make a living. In less than a year, the size of the rebel army increased from the initial 3,000 to 5,000, then to 10,000, and now reaches 50,000. Combined, these fabulous families meant hundreds of thousands of mouths. Similarly, the people in the occupied areas cannot be left alone, so food consumption has reached a terrible situation. What makes matters worse is that almost all of the top rebels belong to the large estate owners and merchant classes. They demand strict compliance with the principles of free trade and the implementation of fair sales. The pricing power of food is in the hands of these upper level officials. The soldiers' military salary used to be enough to feed their families for 3 months, but now it is only enough to feed their families for a week. On the one hand, there is a continuous issuance of free money, and on the other hand, the crazy rise in food prices. In the end, the soldiers were surprised to find that they didn't have enough to eat before the uprising, and they still didn't have enough to eat after the uprising. But how can soldiers fight if they don't have enough to eat? Those fabulous who chose to join in order to have enough to eat, since they can join the rebels, can also join the government forces. It is even more common to kill comrades and defect with guns. General Canabero is just a soldier. He only knows that it is impossible not to let his soldiers eat, nor to be without weapons. As a result, Canabero rejected Garibaldi's suggestion to continue fighting guerrillas in the Kazan jungle and decided to adopt a military adventure strategy. Chapter 389 White People's Lies. Brazil, Laguna City. The commander of the city defense, Colonel Viritis, was having a drink in the headquarters with General Langford, who was about to attack the rebels. The two people, who were comfortable, believed that although the rebels claimed to be 50,000, they were scattered in various places. Moreover, since October last year, rebels have often surrendered in batches. According to General Mastros's estimation, this is a sign that they will not last long. What's even more ridiculous is that the rebel Cannibalo claimed that he would use 4,000 men to capture Laguna City. You must know that there are nearly 50,000 troops in the city at this time, and 1/3 of the Brazilian government forces are gathered here. There is no reason why it will be captured. However, General Langford's 20,000 troops underestimated the enemy and rushed deep into the Kazan jungle and were easily defeated by the rebels' 4,000 strong expeditionary force. Later, General Mastros, the architect of the war, feared punishment and directly became the leader of the rebels. After some thought, Colonel Viritis, who was in charge of garrisoning Laguna City, decided to flee to France with his money. Cannibaro successfully captured the wealthy city of Laguna. The soldiers received supplies, and everything seemed to be heading in the right direction. But it is a pity that the capitulation leaders headed by Mastros carved up the land near Laguna, and the efforts of the Persians only helped them complete the land annexation faster. As for the abolition of slavery, they were in favor of it because the cost of maintenance was too high. It is obviously cheaper to leave the same work to laborers, and it also reduces a lot of responsibility. At the same time, due to the existence of the so-called free market, these guys with huge amounts of capital have fully experienced the benefits of what is called the demographic dividend. The French soldiers in Prussia did not get a break. Due to soaring prices, they had to work on plantations to make ends meet. Moreover, the Fabibus who walked out of the jungle meant losing the advantage of their guerrilla warfare strategy, and instead had to defend the city where the high-ranking officials lived. Due to the lack of heavy firepower, the rebels can only be passively beaten most of the time. Going out to fight in the city is no different than seeking death, while hiding in the city is just trying to survive. Even the top thug, Garibaldi, couldn't think of a way he could secretly blow up part of the opponent's artillery with his men at night, but this method couldn't be successful every time. Laguna City was besieged, and Cannibaro's promised reinforcement had yet to arrive. Garibaldi had already felt that something was wrong. He sent his wife Anita and his son out of the city. Garibaldi is an idealist. He can devote himself to his ideals, but he does not want his wife and newborn son to be like him. After Anita left, Garibaldi was ready to live and die with this city, and there were many Fabibus like him. But those high-ranking officials did not want to be reduced to the dust of history like Fabibus, so they bribed King Pedro II of Brazil to pardon their crimes. The Fabibus, who were already in a difficult situation, now faced the dilemma of being attacked from both sides. The cronies of the large man owner opened the city gates, and Brazilian government troops swarmed in, chasing the Fabibus who were still resisting everywhere. The bloody street fighting lasted for 4 full hours, with Garibaldi and a group of Italian expatriates hiding in a secret arsenal in the city making their last stand. Because there were barricades everywhere, the government's artillery could not be sent in, and the two sides remained in a stalemate until evening. The corpses of Fabibus and the government soldiers overlapped and covered the entire courtyard. The fierce man lit a cigar in the mansion. It was given to him by General Cannibaro before he went on the expedition, saying that he would draw it when the war was won. However, Garibaldi felt that he could not wait for that day. His last companion had just died in front of him. And Garibaldi had no strength left, and there was blood everywhere on his body, from his enemies, his own, and his comrades. He didn't want to know if he was injured or how serious it was, because it didn't matter. Behind Garibaldi was a barrel of black powder, his last resort. Come out and surrender. No one will come to save you, Italian bastards, as long as you are willing to repent in front of the statue of Jesus in St. Paul's Cathedral and admit that it was those Fabians who deceived you. We can forget about it and send you to go to Austria. Colonel Viritis still admires this number 1 thug. If he can let this murderer confess in St. Paul's Cathedral, he will definitely become famous. When the time comes, let alone a general, he will be worthy of being a marshal himself. Come in if you are able, and we will discuss it in detail. Garibaldi said, and even laughed, but it only affected his injury, and coughed up blood. Damn. Thugs, they still want to play tricks when they are about to die. Colonel Virites still cherished his life, pushed that Austrian cannon over, and let him see God. Garibaldi took a deep breath with a smile on his face, as if he was reflecting on his life. Then the floor suddenly moved, and he quickly grabbed the gunpoint, but the next scene made this tough guy's eyes wet. The person who poked his head out was none other than his wife, the Indian girl Adani Ribeiro, who took her husband's last name after getting married. Adani Ribeiro was a very brave girl. She married Garibaldi at the age of 15 and followed him in his wars in the north and south. There was a very dangerous battle, and Garibaldi's ship was besieged by 2 Brazilian warships. The so-called Brazilian battleships are usually equipped with only 1-2 guns and are rated for 10 to 20 people. Cannonballs landed several times on the side of the ship, scaring some sailors into hiding in the cabin. Seeing that there were few people on Garibaldi's first side, the other party prepared to launch a gang-hopping war at this time. It was Adani who drove the cowards out of the cabin, and then took the lead in defeating the Brazilian Navy. On land she was an excellent scout and intelligence agent, always acting as eyes and ears in front of her husband's army, delivering important information at critical moments. She is also an excellent hunter. In the jungle and streams, she can always kill enemy scouts and make them lose their eyes and ears. At this time, the couple looked at each other, and Garibaldi was a little at a loss. "Why are you back again?" "Come to save you," Adani replied. Garibaldi wiped the mixture of sweat, blood, and tears on his face with his hands, which made his eyes even more uncomfortable, and tears flowed out uncontrollably. "Why are you crying? Why don't you run away?" she cursed anxiously. "Oh." He immediately got into the tunnel. "Give me the cigar." Garibaldi handed his victory cigar to his wife, who reached out again and threw the cigar onto the fuse, and then made a squeak sound. The two crawled quickly along the tunnel and soon spotted the light. It turned out that this tunnel was connected to a wine cellar, and there was a secret passage in the wine cellar leading directly to the outside of the city. Even he himself didn't know about this. "How did you discover this tunnel?" "I dug it." "So, when did you start digging?" "I started digging as soon as we entered the city. I did it while you and the big shots were drunk every day." "Why did you dig the secret tunnel? Did you know that there would be a situation like this? If we Indians had completely believed the nonsense of you white people, we would have become extinct long ago." Chapter 390, The Spread of the Epidemic. Bobby Stark is grateful that he was able to sell those cursed potatoes. Otherwise he would have been troubled by defaulting on his debt like his neighbors, because the bankers who lend money don't care about the impact of natural disasters and man-made disasters. If you can't pay the penalty, the house and land used as mortgage will no longer belong to you. It is not unusual to borrow money to farm land in the United States today. Many farmers are carrying debt. After all, the price of land in the United States is relatively cheap at this time, but the cost of development is astonishingly expensive. As Stephen noted, in just a few months potato blight spread throughout Ohio. All potatoes, whether harvested or in the field, are all presented as sticky solid lumps like soap. The stench fills the air and floats to the surrounding farmland. At first, there are only some irregular spots on their leaves, but soon, the spots will expand rapidly, making the entire diseased plant appear water-soaked, and then white mold or brown mold will appear once it catches up with the rainy season. The onset will be faster, and even a large area of land can be destroyed in 1 or 2 days. The fields are filled with farmers hoping to find uninfected potatoes. But this was undoubtedly in vain, as the natural disaster came so suddenly and violently. The crying farmers did not attract mercy from God, but only the ridicule of the surrounding farmers who grew other crops and the contempt of the bankers for the losers. After all, if the potato harvest fails, other crops can be sold at a better price. In the eyes of bankers, those farmers who suffered sudden blows are just numbers whose investments have failed. These timid guys don't have the courage to accept failure. They are really a bunch of useless trash. The tragedy in Ohio did not attract the attention of Washington. The mainstream economic thought at the time was free trade and the government should reduce its intervention. The local government report also concluded with an extremely understatement. A large number of farmers failed to invest, resulting in a large area of land waste. John Tyler was an efficient leader who could not accept farmers' waste of American land. Therefore, instead of introducing a relief policy, the US government imposed fines on those farms that were affected by the disaster because they wasted the precious resources God gave America and cultivated some worthless commodities on the land that were supposed to be planted with crops. What's more, it has caused a further decline in potato production in the United States, and at the same time, changed the structure of its crop cultivation, making the potato planting area less than 1/2 of France, less than 1/3 of Austria, and only 4/4 of the area in Germany. A little more than 1/3 for the United States. These bankrupt farmers are not completely useless. They could go into factories, or go to the Great West, to develop new lands. For example, at this time, there was fierce competition between Britain and the United States in Oregon. Although Britain was strong, the United States had an advantage that the other side did not have: manpower. Thousands of Americans would migrate to the area after the Oregon Trail became the main route into the area in 1842. On the other hand, the British could not even gather enough colonists to effectively control the area, so they could actually only be in a state of strategic contraction. But even this cannot escape the encroachment of the Americans. John Taylor's plan can be said to be very successful. However, it was not all smooth sailing, such as the Abinan massacre. 13 white men accidentally broke into Indian territory and cut down their sacred trees, leading to serious conflicts between the two sides. In the end, all 13 warriors were unfortunately killed in the colony. After learning the news, John Taylor immediately delivered a eulogy for them at the White House and vowed to take revenge on the savage Indians. Approximately 360 immigrants died at the hands of Native Americans in Oregon between 1840 and 1860. Between 1830 and 1840 alone, the number of Indians in Oregon dropped by 100,000. Of course, the Americans have not given up infiltrating the California area, but they have been resolved by the newly appointed Austrian governor in the area in the most primitive and bloody way. The number of Americans killed so far in California has exceeded 3,000, but neither side admits this fact on the surface. In fact, Franz doesn't really agree with this approach, but it is undoubtedly very effective and cheap. But this method of raising red flags can be used by Austria, the United States, and even the Mexicans once the door to hell is opened. It is difficult to close. Of course, introducing American immigrants to jointly develop California can also be considered. After all, turning enemies into friends is the wisest method in theory, and what California is most lacking at this time is labor. But bloody historical experience and lessons tell us that this kind of behavior is tantamount to inviting a wolf into the house and is not worth a risk. Although there were 4 forces entrenched in the North American continent at this time, the British focus had shifted to Asia and their ambitions were not here. So the world was still divided into 3 parts. Theoretically, the French are the strongest, and neither the quality of their military nor their national strength can be compared with that of the other 2 countries. But it is a continental country after all, and is constrained by Britain and other continental powers, preventing it from exerting its full power. Although the United States has a large population and a vast territory, its organizational efficiency is low, and even one John Taylor cannot make a difference. But even so, it is still the country with the most potential and the most threat in North America. After all, in history, the United States gradually became the world's hegemon after opening up the 2 oceans. But it was not so easy in this life. Mexico had always thrived under Franz's special care, but as the saying goes, the incompetence of one general exhausts the 3 armies. Neither Tassigana nor the top management in Mexico City were very talented and ambitious people, and they began to enjoy themselves without shame within a few days of settling down. The collective treason of the elite class is nothing new in Mexico. Austria can bribe these people, France can bribe them, and the United States and Britain can also copy them. It's just that the Tassigana faction in power now has good relations with the Austrian side. But this cannot stop some warlords from coveting the California region. As a result, there are always some people who overestimate their own abilities and feel that they are the real owners of gold. Although the Austrian Empire only has more than 10,000 troops in California, they are still not comparable to those motley troops in Mexico. The battles are bloody and brutal. but also absurd and boring point. The Mexican army in the plains under the banner of the US military was attacked with unprecedented violence. The panicked soldiers routinely surrendered, but they were treated not as Mexicans, but as invaders. Prisoners of war were sent to the mines and wastelands to perform the most dangerous and arduous labor. Consul John Cinna felt that he was one step closer to the goal set by Archduke Franz. Chapter 391 The Spread of the Plague. United States, Washington. Even as President John Tyler decided to impose sanctions on those who wasted America's rich soil, potato late blight had spread to surrounding provinces in the following months. The disease swept through the entire United States like a plague. Fortunately, people here did not eat potatoes as a staple food, so only some people suffered losses. In fact, as long as you don't put all your eggs in one basket, most of them will not be unable to survive. In the end, John Tyler's presidential order discredited him and became one of the things his opponents used to attack him in the future. Mr. Stephen, who had predicted all this long ago, was regarded as a madman before the disastrous potato blight came, and was regarded as a wizard after the disastrous potato blight. Wizards are considered evil in traditional Western culture. The windows of Stephen Supple's family were smashed. 2 children were thrown cow dung at school. He himself was beaten up by 2 drunks, and someone even broke into his house and set it on fire. Jenna, I want to sell the house and go to the West, Stephen said after thinking for a long time. There really no other way. Jenna had tears in her eyes. She obviously did not want to leave her home at this time and go to the West. When talking about the American West, the vast, beautiful, and desolate scenery comes to many people's minds. A spiny sand tree is rolling by in the wind next to the yellow sand. Leather boots, spurs, and a cowboy hat are on the head, and the American IAI is used whenever there is a disagreement. A tumbleweed is a tumbleweed, the yellow spherical dead grass that often appears in cowboy movies. A group of people happily drove in a caravan, with a blonde beauty on one side and a double-barreled shotgun on the other side, to kill Indians who appeared at any time. Fertile land is full of gold. Even if you don't dig gold, grow grain, or raise cattle, you can become a super rich man. In addition to drinking and fighting every day, I just watch kick dancing. If you think so, then the United States' more than 200 years of beautifying propaganda have not been in vain. In fact, it is not easy to make a living in the West. It usually takes several months to travel through harsh environments such as mountains and deserts. Water and food are top priorities on the way. If you want to reach the West safely, these are not enough. You also need to pay a lot of money to hire a guide. Of course, the premise is that the guide has real talent and knowledge and has no collusion with the bandits. Wild beasts, rattlesnakes, intense heat, sandstorms, and tornadoes are all very common, but you have to face them. If you want to reach the West, then there is a settlement site selection. You need to avoid areas frequented by Indians, bandits, and places where natural disasters may occur. Clearing land is also a tiring job, and it is common for half of one's livestock to be exhausted in order to complete the work. But we have to admit that the land in the United States is indeed fertile. As long as the seeds are sown, it is difficult not to have a good harvest. Unless there is a particularly extreme disaster, the shortfall will definitely be filled. However, the American West at this time was much more dangerous than in history. The French, Mexicans, Indians, bounty hunters hired by Austria, and bandits from the Great Plains were all very dangerous existences. The book returns to its true story. Stephen said softly while stroking his wife's long hair. Bobby fired me, and the people here hate me, and there's no way to support you without a job. We'll have a chance out West. Jenna took off her necklace, which was a relic left to her by her mother. What are you doing? This is your mother's relic, Stephen asked in surprise. Buy 2 guns. We will use them on the road, Jenna said with firm eyes. Stephen sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing, and that they really needed weapons to protect themselves. Go to bed early. There are still many things to be busy with tomorrow. Good night, dear. Good night. Ireland, Queen's Village. Scathach Jennings was wandering outside the village with her 2 brothers Mickey and Tommy and the family's old dog, hoping to collect more firewood. This would protect her from the cold, since her youngest sister Eileen was only 1 year old. However, Scathach didn't gain much, and the 2 younger brothers were busy playing around The old dog Hook caught an unlucky field mouse. It seemed that he could get an extra meal tonight. Her eldest brother Patrick always did not do serious things, and his favorite thing to attend was drinking parties. The drinking party is not actually a place for drinking, and there is no alcohol. They are a secret society, an illegal organization among the British population. But it was no secret among country bumpkins like them that almost every family in Ireland had a member who took part in it at one point or another. In fact, the vast majority of Irish people hope to end British colonial rule, but their power is too weak. The old people believe that knowledge is power, so they select some people who may be promising to study. But after some people who had read the book knew how powerful Britain was, they in turn advised the Irish not to resist, and even helped the British to harm their own compatriots. Thatcher's father was very opposed to her eldest brother attending the reception, because it would not only delay farm work, but might even get him involved in dangerous politics. Thatcher's father was afraid of politics, saying that politics was the culprit that makes the nights darker. She was not interested in the quarrels between her father and her eldest brother. What interested her most recently were the new priests who had arrived in recent years. Although these priests come from several different countries, they can communicate in the same language. And just like a groundhog, he digs cellars or tunnels every day and hoards all the donations he receives. Of course, the donations from the villagers were not that large. After all, most of the Irish farmers did not have enough to eat themselves, and most of the landowners were not Irish, and even those who believed in it were Protestant. These churches usually only received potatoes and wild vegetables, and Thatch still remembers the first time the new parish priest drank rapeseed soup with the children. As soon as Tang entered the room, the priest's eyes widened, and he looked around thinking that the children were playing tricks on him. But after seeing all the children swallowing the soup, the priest took a deep breath and began to drink the soup. After repeating it several times, he finally showed everyone a smile that was uglier than crying. Mysterious donors who appear regularly will donate pounds or wheat directly, which are also the sources of Holy Communion in the church. Of course, the nearby villagers are not willing to let their children go to church to receive Holy Communion, because after eating white bread, they will feel that the food at home is unpalatable. At first, before these strange priests came, Holy Communion could only be received once a year. After they came, it became once a week, and later it was changed to once a month at the suggestion of the villagers. These priests like to inquire about the situation here very much, and they will visit everywhere to draw maps, and even inquire about the situation of the British. Thatch thought they were a group of spies, so he secretly asked the priest during confession, but he denied it. Her eldest brother Patrick denied this, because the priests were all asking about local customs, as well as the preferences and policies of the British. Many people in the organization approached these priests and said they would fight to overthrow British rule and whatever Catholic country would rule Ireland in the future. But these priests all have the same message, that is, they are here only to save the world, not to provoke war. In fact, what these priests told were not lies, because they were all instructed by Franz, and he did not want or need these priests to know too much. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 392 Bordeaux Liquid. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz had tried to alert London to the horror of potato late blight through secret private channels, but the latter seemed to have no response, and the former could not reveal his identity, so he had to resign himself to fate. In addition, the solution to this famine can also start from the root cause. There are two ways to prevent and control this pathogen. One is to select high quality species, and the other is to control it with pesticides. However, there are a lot of troubles in the actual implementation of the above two methods. First, potato late blight has not appeared in Austria. To put it another way, at least it has not spread here yet. As for buying the virus strain and actively infecting it, this act of seeking death would not be done as long as the brain is not broken. It is also not feasible to bring those strains carrying potato late blight to China for research, because this country has rain all year round. Once the germs enter the atmospheric circulation, they can easily spread throughout the empire and trigger an agricultural crisis. Not only will other countries make a lot of money, but the country will also be more likely to fall into continued chaos due to economic and social crises. As for pesticides, at this time Europeans would use powder made from pyrethrum to control pests. That's right. It is the most powerful natural insecticide in modern times, and Europeans began to use it in the 19th century. However, due to the trouble of preparation, it did not become popular. Instead, it was later discovered that chemical preparations that were easy to prepare began, and the history of large-scale use of pesticides began. Then after going around for more than 100 years, it was finally discovered that natural products were better. However, the development of pesticides against mold is lagging behind. These people will only mix tobacco and lime and then light it in the farmland. As for the effect, it depends entirely on God's will. Franz knew that sulfur was used in the East in ancient times, but he did not know whether it was effective in preventing potato late blight. For this reason, Franz tried to turn to the Royal Society of Science for help, but even the geniuses gathered there were at a loss to start. As mentioned earlier, it is absolutely impossible to bring this germ back into the country because the risk cannot be ignored, and it is completely unnecessary for the empire to lose more than the gain. Franz had to do the opposite and ordered his subordinates and related personnel to collect improved seeds from all over Europe and Asia, and then sent special personnel to transport them to Ireland to see if they would be infected with potato late blight. Although this is an afterthought method, it is also a hopeless method. In addition, Franz still vividly remembered a simple pesticide preparation method he learned in junior high school chemistry class. And he also mentioned it later when he heard people bragging about wine. That's right, it's Bordeaux liquid. The materials and chemical formula required for this pesticide are copper sulfate plus quicklime plus water. Although I forgot the specific proportion, it is correct to add more. After figuring it out, Franz immediately came to his laboratory, poured some white crystals, anhydrous copper sulfate, and white powder, quicklime, into a container filled with water, and then stirred it with a glass lid. Soon the crystals and powder disappeared, and the originally clear and transparent liquid turned blue. But after finishing the preparation, he discovered a problem. His little sister Maria was biting her fingers and staring at the bottle of blue liquid in her hand. It was obvious that she had mistaken it for a blue drink, which made Franz dumbfounded. Didn't that damn Bordeaux say that his defense is the same as Cheyenne? How come even a kid can break through so easily? In fact, Colonel Bordeaux also felt that he had been wronged. If the visitor had other identities, he would have been able to stop him, but if the visitor was a princess, there was nothing he could do. Soon after, Colonel Bordeaux's eyes caught sight of Madame Sophie, who was looking for the little princess, and he immediately saluted respectfully. "Hello, Mrs. Sophie, thank you for your hard work, Mrs." Sophie looked this man up and down, and then she remembered that this man was the male attendant she had selected for Franz to be responsible for safety. His family has been loyal to the royal family for 15 generations and has never produced a scumbag, but this descendant is not very smart. "Give it to me." "No, I want a drink." "That's not a drink." Wow. The argument between the brother and sister ended with little Maria crying. Franz decided to teach him a lesson first and then give him a candy as usual. But as soon as she lifted little Maria and put her on her lap, Mrs. Sophie stopped her. "Franz, what are you doing? As an elder brother, how could you do this to your young sister?" He knew that it would be useless to explain that a small tree will not grow into a towering tree if it is not pruned. He simply put little Maria down and said, "I was wrong, mother, but the liquid in the bottle is indeed very dangerous. I just wanted to stop my sister from doing stupid things. Mom, my elder brother hit me just now. He also pulled my hair out." Little Maria said, and pulled out her hair twice, but it was a pity that Franz had already made the matter clear. First point, even if the doting little daughter acts rogue again, Mrs. Sophie will be able to understand the whole story at a glance. But for the sake of her daughter's face, she still has to do superficial things. Then, how about mom? Teach this unreliable brother a lesson for you. She gave him 2 symbolic blows before preparing to take little Mariah away. However, she was already very dissatisfied in her heart. If this matter had been replaced by Mariah's 3 brothers, she would have been taught a lesson point, but Mariah is a girl after all, and Mrs. Sophie still can't be cruel point. But when he saw the bottle of blow liquid on the eldest son's table, he asked curiously, "What's in this?" Franz immediately had a solution after seeing his mother's expression. However, in order to reduce unnecessary trouble, he chose to tell the truth: pesticides. After Mrs. Sophie was convinced that this was not an item suitable for human consumption, she had to swallow her saliva. "I really don't understand what you are thinking about in your head all day long. The king is not a scholar, and tinkering with these messy tricks all day long is not the work of a wise man. Point. Even if you have a strong interest, you can leave it to the experts and professors, and you should spend more time studying with the ministers. Recently, the prime minister and the archbishop rarely enter the palace. I personally invite people to invite you, but I can't preach to you. What good things have you done? Also, don't hang out with Friedrich all the time. That prodigal just spends money like water." "Yes, I will be very close to the prime minister and the archbishop. What about Uncle Albrecht?" Franz asked. After all, this was a war hero at this time. It's better to have less contact. There is no serious person in your Uncle Cowl's family. The elder married a Protestant, and the 3 younger ones are all unmarried. If there were not several daughters still alive, I'm afraid he will be extinct in a few years. Although Mrs. Sophie's barbed words are unpleasant, they are true. Point. As a nobleman who grew up in a devoutly Catholic family, Archduke Karol was forced to marry because of his old age, so he searched around the German states and finally got a Protestant. Point. This was the first interreligious marriage in the history of the Habsburg family, which caused a storm in the city and ultimately affected their political future. Point. Albrecht, Karl Ferdinand, and Friedrich were already over the marriageable age, but they didn't even have a lover, let alone a wife. Point. At this time, little Mariah, who was tired from crying, actually fell asleep on Mrs. Sophie's shoulder. "Your sister fell asleep, and I took her back. You can take care of yourself, mother. Please walk slowly." Franz saluted respectfully. Chapter 393. Be prepared. The benefits of industrialization are obvious. It makes goods cheap and highly reliable. Point. At least there won't be a situation where the first bottle of wine from the same workshop is very delicious, but the second bottle will make you vomit out all your dinner. But it has also led to a problem. That is, traditional breweries continue to close down, and their living space is constantly being squeezed. Even if Franz has left them profit margins in terms of price and other aspects in addition, in order to leave a way for those taverns to survive as much as possible, Franz adopted the wholesaler model. Except for some royal properties, he needed to purchase from wholesalers. Although this business model is relatively backward in modern times, it was definitely one of the most reasonable models in the 19th century. Franz hopes to preserve the good ones and eliminate the not so good ones. The industrialization of drinks is irreversible, because with the advent of the industrial age and the increase in population, people's demand for drinks is also increasing. The past manual methods are obviously not enough to meet people's growing needs, which requires reform or increased investment. It was naturally impossible for Franz to devote all his precious resources to brewing wine. With the expansion of the empire and the development of the times, there were too many places that needed money and people. Therefore, choosing cheaper and more efficient industrial production is an inevitable choice. At the same time, the earlier industrialization occurs, the easier it is to take the initiative in the market. February 11th, 1843. Franz's father was assassinated by a brew pub owner. When the carriage passed the tavern, the owner suddenly rushed out from the roadside and shot the carriage compartment with a pistol, but the bullet failed to penetrate the steel plate wrapped outside. The attacker was caught on the spot, and after a 72-hour interrogation, the prisoner died in prison. But the result was that no useful information was obtained, except that the prisoner had a grudge because the new beer sold by the royal family had affected his business. In fact, Franz also allowed the beer hall to sell royal products, but the owner wanted to sell his own wine. The tavern's turnover dropped, causing him to feel depressed, and under the influence of alcohol, he decided to assassinate members of the royal family. Franz looked at the Photo of the prisoner's body. There was not a single piece of intact flesh on his body. It seemed that what he was telling the truth must be true point. But it's a pity that Franz can't save him, because no one can go against the tide of the times. There can't be only one such person. It seems that it is difficult to be a good person or a bad person. However, in order to prevent similar incidents from happening, precautions should be taken early. Franz believed that the best way was to completely ban guns, but such a law could not be completed in the social environment at the time, or the resistance was too great. However, a registration system can be considered. That is, a gun license is required to purchase and hold firearms, and taxes need to be paid. At the same time, we will intensify the inspection of guns entering and exiting the city, and increase the number of police patrols. However, it is not easy for the Regency Council to pass these laws. The top priority is to start with ourselves. Franz completely modified the carriage used by his family to match his own carriage. Bulletproof glass plus steel plates are a must. This will undoubtedly increase the weight of the carriage. The Grand Duke cannot make a 6-horse carriage, so he will replace it with 4 horses and 2 mules. Anyway, the Franz family's mental disorder is not a matter of 1 or 2 days. Then there is a need to strengthen the security force. Previously, Archduke Franz Karol only had 22 guards, including the 2 captains of the bodyguard. Franz decided to increase this number to 102 people, and Franz was responsible for the additional 80 people. For this reason, Franz felt it was necessary to set up a security company, which relied on the relationship between Archduke Karl and his family. After all, their family had a very good relationship with the military. Moreover, Archduke Karol himself often recruited some capable veterans and retired officers to work in his manor, or in the guard. Vienna, a Brecht Palace. Today's Albertina Museum and adjacent streets. This is the Winter Palace of Archduke Karol, and the whole palace has a warm and cheerful atmosphere. Grand Duchess Carolina, wearing a white dress and riding a solid black horse, ran rampant on the lawn of the palace. The servants turned a blind eye, and a trembling old housekeeper walked up to Franz's car. "Hello, distinguished Archduke Franz. My master has been waiting for you for a long time. Okay, please lead the way." Franz replied politely. A team of nearly 200 people entered the manor in a mighty manner. Only then did Carolina realize that the guest was Franz, and she rushed over on horseback. This behavior naturally led to a commotion. Franz's guards raised their guns and stood in front of Franz, while the guards of Archduke Karol's family also raised their guns and aimed at the royal guards who might threaten their own young ladies. This made the old housekeeper anxious. "Put it down. Put down your guns. Miss, get off your horse first. Archduke Franz is here. Don't be too rude. Put down your guns." Franz yelled, but Colonel Bordeaux wanted to refute, but Franz didn't want to give him this chance. "Shut up. Put down the guns." The royal guards put away their guns, and Archduke Karol's family guards naturally put away their guns without being entangled. Carolina also realized that there seemed to be something wrong with her behavior, and quickly got off the horse. Archduke Karol didn't like to interact with others, and the people who came here to visit their family were usually soldiers, and didn't care about Carolina's impolite behavior. "Cousin Franz." She rushed over and hugged Franz. Fortunately, the latter was in good physical condition and had been exercising for a long time, otherwise he would have been knocked down by this attack. The butler on the side reminded, "Probably, nephew." Miss Carolina turned back and glared at the old housekeeper. "No, you don't need to bother me." The old housekeeper was speechless for a while, but he still went ahead to lead the way. The architectural styles of the entire palace are diverse, from Gothic to Baroque to Rococo. Carolina was also chirping beside Franz, and Jenny deliberately kept a long distance to avoid being accidentally hurt. "Franz, have you grown taller again? Why don't you smile? Are you trying to be cool? By the way, I can ride a horse and swim." Franz didn't know how to communicate with an adolescent girl. After all, he couldn't pick her up and beat her like his sister. "That's great, aunt. I wonder what books you usually like to read." Carolina was speechless for a moment. She had no problem reading and writing. However, due to her excessively free upbringing and the special environment at home, she had almost no communication with her peers, and it was naturally impossible for her to study on war. Kiralina recalled in desperately on a book her father had mentioned. Franz smiled. Well, let me test you. What should be the speed of normal march and forced march? Kiralina's head was full of black lines, and she thought to herself, why are the men around me like this? Are they all war mad? After some questioning from Franz, Kiralina had no choice but to turn around and run away. Chapter 394 Umbrella. Vienna, a Brecht Palace. Uncle Karl, I need an army. Franz said straight to the point. Archduke Karl did not talk to his grandnephew many times, but this did not prevent the latter from being one of the few people he recognized. Didn't your grandfather leave you a dragoon regiment during his lifetime? Isn't 3,000 troops enough for you? Franz shook his head and replied, Uncle, after trying for a while, I found that there are indeed not enough people, and they are not suitable for the tasks I gave them. Archduke Karl suddenly became interested. He wanted to hear what wonderful ideas were coming from this junior's head. What I desperately need are soldiers who are professional and follow orders. These dragoons are the best of the best. If they are not professional enough and obey orders, then who else will? The veteran who walked out of the sea of blood from the corpses raised his eyebrows thoughtfully. He didn't think that the troops directly under the royal family could degenerate to such an extent. Especially the personal guards prepared for the new king would not be a bunch of losers. No, they are all excellent soldiers, but what I need are mercenaries. Do you mean that you need a group of consumables that can be discarded at any time? Archduke Karl said with a hint of sullenness in his tone. Seeing that the other party didn't seem to be trying to quibble, he turned to speak seriously. My many years of wandering on the battlefield of life and death have taught me that soldiers' lives should not be played with so easily. Sometimes the country cannot officially recognize that they are fighting for the country, but it can make up for it with material things. Franz replied, do you understand what you are saying? This is a blasphemy against the honor of the warriors, and from ancient times to the present, no army that is completely tempted by money can maintain combat effectiveness for a long time. Archduke Karl was still explaining what he knew, and hoped that the other party would listen. Uncle, I have absolutely no intention of letting mercenaries replace the regular army. It's just that sometimes under certain circumstances an army of mercenaries is needed to complete some tasks that are not obvious and not so glorious. Of course I don't want anyone to sacrifice their lives in vain, so I came here to ask you for some soldiers and commanders who can perform special missions. If you're not willing to help, then I can leave right away. Although Franz came here on the pretext of increasing security for the royal family, he actually came for a pair of black gloves that he could get his hands on. The problem of the guards is easy to solve. It is not a problem to select a few thousand young men from the families who have been loyal to Habsburg for generations and train them. But a group of cheap scapegoats cannot rely on such selection criteria. The church can take the blame, but it cannot be embarrassed in Europe. Fanatic believers tend to go their own way, but mercenaries are efficient, cheap, and adaptable to different environments and situations. As for providing security for the royal family, it is nothing more than a gimmick. As long as financial resources allow, the royal guards can expand as much as they want, and they are valued more for their loyalty than their combat effectiveness. What Franz longs for is a force that can stir up troubles in the world. In fact, it's not that he hasn't tried other paths, such as the Knights of the Holy Sword who conspired with the Archbishop. They may not be weak in terms of combat power alone, but the moral obsessiveness of this group of people means that they cannot play the role of black gloves at all. For example, the Aboriginal people who relocated to Central America ultimately relied on the help of local landowners and gentry. In the stormy years to come, having more troops under his control would give him more confidence in survival. He could leave Archduke Karl and his family alone and set up a mercenary organization similar to the modern Blackwater Company, and even its capabilities perhaps it is not inferior to what the latter helped to establish. But without this bond, Franz would always feel a little uneasy. Then, let me ask you, in your eyes, what is the meaning of the existence of soldiers in the army? It is the country's violent machine and a tool to maintain rule. No matter what the military does, it has only one ultimate goal, and that is to maintain rule and allow the country to continue. Point the same is true for soldiers. They are a group of flesh and blood people, but they must put aside their personal feelings and even the consumables of life. Franz knew the other party's next reply, so he recited the knight's declaration that he could recite fluently, trying to make him understand that times had changed. I swear to heaven to make my will clear. Don't bully the weak. Spend your time humbly in the battles you go through. Don't be afraid of powerful enemies. If there is any evil, I will attack it. Point. When women are weak and children grow up, war will do them. A woman is delicate and should never offend. Colleagues share the same goals and work hard to help each other. Treat friends sincerely and consider yourself a gentleman. My true love is unwavering. Archduke Karol was a little surprised when he heard Franz reciting the knight's proclamation. He always thought that the boy in front of him lacked relevant emotions and was more like a businessman than a nobleman, and he didn't understand the spirit of chivalry. Franz, I don't understand. Since you know the meaning of knighthood and honor, why do you learn to think like a dirty politician? Well, how many of the empire's bureaucrats and lawyers are not high-sounding or righteous in front of others, but have another kind of virtue behind them? They understand, and often use those laws and regulations and moral viewpoints, but when it comes to actually doing things, it may be another story. Point. Uncle Carl. Many years ago servants had already allegorized the end of the future age of chivalry in his Don Quixote. At present, the torrent of capital is rolling in. We must either make changes, or we will be overwhelmed by it sooner or later. Archduke Karol understood that what Franz said was true. Even the crusaders who claimed to fight for the faith could rob the people they were obsessed with saving for the sake of wealth. The destruction of the Knights Templar was no better than this. But people can't live just for money. His answer seemed very unconfident, because it seemed to make sense. If this theory of naked money and capital was applied to everything that had happened throughout the ages. But Archduke Karol still believed that talent was the master, not just wealth. Of course not. It's just that black and white, light and darkness, good and evil, right and wrong all exist relative to each other. The sun cannot grow alone, and the yin alone cannot grow. Point. Any unilateral behavior is a violation of balance. If the balance of force is broken, the state of objects will change. A person's psychological imbalance will make his character become extreme. The imbalance of power in the regime will make the country go berserk. Archduke Karol felt dizzy after hearing this. After all, the above discussion was too complicated for a pure soldier in this era. That's enough. Franz, you are becoming more and more like a philosopher. Tell me your true plans. The relieved Franz quickly drank a cup of coffee to calm down his shock, but because the taste was too strong, he stuck out his tongue. I am determined to build a universal empire, so that all poor people in the world will be happy. Let the laborers be paid, the nobles should bear their responsibilities, the poor should have their respect, and the rich should be put to their best use. The good will be honored, the bad will be punished, and the lonely will be punished. Everyone has their own nourishment. Before he could finish speaking, he was immediately interrupted by Archduke Karol. Obviously, the latter did not want to hear these theories on governance. After all, he was just a soldier. Okay, I admit that your vision is not wrong. You may become a good emperor in the future, or you may follow in the footsteps of our crazy uncle. Point. Of course, these are not things I can judge at the moment. From now on, I will try my best to help you. No matter what extraordinary things you want to do, or what crazy actions you want to do, I will support you. You finally agreed. Archduke Karol nodded and took out a box. This is a file of outstanding veterans and officers from the entire empire in the past 10 years. They are all good guys. I hope you can make the best use of them. He did not beat around the bush, but went straight to the point. Well, Uncle Carl. Franz's solemn reply with a solemn expression made Archduke Karol feel a little relieved, and the latter asked immediately, does the security company you just mentioned have a name? Franz thought for a while. It wasn't there just now, but it is now. Umbrella Company. Chapter 395. Bugs in the British Back Garden. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace Point. Since the trade agreement was signed with the Shudra of Viroy Sadani last year, orders from India have never stopped, and the total number has exceeded 20,000 rifles and 400,000 rounds of ammunition. With equipment of this size, it may not be a problem to capture the entire Trivandrum kingdom. And Franz has not heard of any big moves on the Indian side. On the contrary, the British felt disgraced after the failure of the war in Afghanistan. Coupled with the outbreak of the domestic economic crisis, they urgently needed to transfer domestic conflicts and consume as much of this batch of materials as possible. However, the British searched around Europe and finally did not dare to take action, and finally chose the lucky one of Sind, India. In fact, the Sind king Baloch also wanted to take advantage of the British's new defeat to drive the colonists out of their own land, or at least get a relatively equal and unequal treaty. In fact, as early as 1832, the British forced the three emirs, another name for the kings, of Sind to sign an unequal treaty. Later, the invasion deepened in 1839. Not only did the three princely states become vassal states of Britain, they even lost the ownership of their land and the right to defend their own security. Of course, while occupying all important military fortresses, the British did not forget to provide conveniences to British merchants. That is, the princely states did not have the right to tax British goods. In order to further weaken their resistance, the local British governor also instigated infighting among the three kingdoms to consume their strength. Beginning in September 1842, due to the impact of the defeat in Afghanistan, British rule began to waver. The radical General Richard Napier decided to resolve the Sind problem once and for all. He put forward extremely harsh conditions to the three kings of Sind, increased the tribute requirements, and prepared to distribute their lands to the more obedient kings. However, the strength of both sides forced the three Sind kings to agree to cede land and pay compensation. However, soon after, the businessman Veroes found them and said that he had many weapons in his hands and could sell them cheaply. As a result, the three princely states of Sind united together, elected Baloch as their leader, and began to secretly gather together to fight against the British. The original plan was very thorough, and the number of resistance fighters was approaching 30,000. And they were also equipped with a large number of obsolete weapons from Austria. These old-fashioned smoothbore shotguns and small-caliber artillery, as well as primitive Congreve rockets and granulated black powder, were enough to fight a small war on the European continent. However, there is no impermeable wall in this world, and there is never a shortage of traitors. Someone tipped off the British colonial government, but General Napier selectively turned a blind eye to the information of 30,000 troops and a large amount of military equipment. The local British army consisted of 3,000 men and 12 cannons. Napier still confidently issued an ultimatum to the Sind state and saw the matter exposed. Some members of the rebel army decided to take action in advance and sent troops to directly attack the British governor's palace. But it turned out to be exactly what Napier was trying to do, and the attackers were ambushed by the British army and suffered heavy losses. On February 1, 1843, General Napier led 2,800 British troops to attack on his own initiative, catching Baloch by surprise. The Sindhi army was defeated by the British army despite their overwhelming numerical superiority. In addition to strategic mistakes, lack of fighting will is the key. At that time, there were more than 10,000 main rebels in the city of Miami, but they were panicked and the battle lines were in chaos when faced with the sudden attack by the British army. The 61-year-old General Napier saw the opportunity and ordered the soldiers to launch a bayonet charge. In the end, in brutal hand-to-hand combat, more than 5,000 rebel fighters were captured, 1,200 were killed, 3,000 were missing, and more than 8,000 rifles and 2 weapons were seized. 10 cannons. The British lost less than 200 men. Resistance leader Baloch fled back to Hyderabad with only 15 followers. General Napier decided to pursue the victory regardless of the fatigue of his men from consecutive days of fighting, and forced his way through the desert to attack Hyderabad without any backup supplies. Hyderabad is the headquarters and fortress of the Sind resistance army and the most important supply point, but this time the veteran miscalculated. Crossing the desert was more difficult than he imagined. And this time Baloch's army was well prepared. 30 cannons, 2,000 Congreve rockets, and 20,000 fully armed local soldiers killed more than 2,000 British troops who were pursuing them. In fact, the battle only killed a small number of British troops, but the locals had no idea about prisoners of war. They gathered together those British who had laid down their weapons, and then started a crazy massacre. This was the greatest victory achieved by the locals, and even India, over the British. As they celebrated, Edward Law, Earl of Ellenborough, also toasted in his governor's palace because he finally found the breakthrough. The longer the war lasts, the bigger and more tragic it is, the more it can divert domestic conflicts. But the death of Lieutenant General Napier still reminded Earl Ellenborough that he did not want to overturn like the previous Governor General of India. Neither Afghans, Indians, nor Pakistanis should take it lightly. So he sent an army of unprecedented size to conquer. Of course, Franz, who was far away in Europe at this time, could only speculate on his own, estimating that another war had broken out on the Indian subcontinent. Now the Austrian military's inventory was finally being exhausted, although Count Latter felt that it would be profitable to sell new guns to the Indians. Franz did not intend to do so. Firstly, the cost of new guns is much higher. The cost difference is about 5%. And secondly, Franz does not intend to let the technology spread. So Franz pointed out a new way to Vera Wise and asked him to go to Chandler to buy weapons. This would not only save time, but also save costs at the same time. It can inject new vitality into Austria's colonies. The most important thing is to completely reduce Chandler to a link in the entire colonial system. In fact, the main reason is that with the stabilization of the political situation, the local population has also increased. However, due to Franz's large-scale promotion of rubber planting in the local area, the land for growing food will inevitably decrease. Importing from Thailand is a good choice in the short term, but it is unsafe to put all your eggs in one basket, not to mention that Kalimantan and Sulawesi will also follow in Chandler's footsteps in this way. It was very important to open up the trade routes in India. Of course, Franz was also leaving a way out for those who resisted British colonial rule. After all, gold and silver are always limited, and even if they empty out all the money accumulated by their ancestors in those temples, they won't be able to sustain it for long. But cash crops and grains are different. They mature every year and are harvested every year. And only in this way can we truly incorporate it into our own system, and only in this way can the interests of both parties be tied together. The Indian subcontinent is a treasure trove of resources, the pearl of the British Empire, and its continuous blood transfusions to the United Kingdom have kept it in an invincible position. Franz always believed in a saying, to put out a fire, you must draw out the firepower from the bottom of the cauldron. And to cut the grass, you must root out the root. And he hopes that India can always become a resource-based country, which is in Austria's best interest. Chapter 396 Little Things in a Small Town. Bavaria, close to the Alps. Mrs. Sophie took Maria to Persinophen, a castle far away from the hustle and bustle. But it's more like a farm than a castle. Mrs. Sophie's sister Ludovica lives here. At first she hated this remote village and her incompetent brother-in-law. Of course, Mrs. Sophie did not come here to find a future wife for Franz. After all, in her eyes, the girls Ludovica gave birth to were as stupid as her and would not be helpful to Franz at all. The most important thing is their status. It's too low, completely unequal to Franz. But Madame Sophie came more often than ever before, mainly because Franz did a lot of things she was supposed to do, and did them better. Madame Sophie had nothing to do, so naturally she only had two options, showing off her baby and visiting relatives. Although Franz also found some things for her to do, such as makeup and fashion design, it was still not enough to kill her time and energy. Mrs. Sophie preferred her daughter Maria to her four sons. As a result, poor Maria had to follow Mrs. Sophie on her expeditions all day long. Of course, little Maria actually likes to be with girls of the same age. Although Nana, Princess Helen, is only 1 year older than her, she is like an older sister and always takes care of her. As for Sissy, although she is 2 years younger than her, she is even naughtier than her. This was the first time Maria knew what naughty meant. After all, being naughty was her prerogative in Schönbrunn Palace. However, Maria still liked her cousin very much, and she would share any good things she had with the two sisters. For example, toothpaste, lollipops, small dresses, small toys, and jewelry. Among them, Franz asked her to bring the toothpaste. After all, he didn't want to see Princess Sissy with the same 2 rows of yellow teeth as in history. In fact, the British industrialized the production of tooth powder as early as the 18th century, but the market response was not good. People still don't like this kind of dental care products that are cumbersome to use and inconvenient to carry. Historically, the French invented the metal hose in 1840, but in fact it was not until 1893 that the Austrians put toothpaste into a hose to make the first modern toothpaste. In this generation, Franz tinkered with metal hoses in 1837 in order to improve steam turbines. The use of metal hoses to make modern toothpaste is just a byproduct, but it was only then that toothpaste really began to enter the public eye and gradually transformed into a daily necessity. From the invention of metal hoses to the invention of toothpaste with chalk soil as a friction agent, soap as a cleanser, and glycerine as a moisturizer, and finally putting it into a metal hose, Franz simply advanced this process by 50 years. Ludovica still admires her sister very much. After all, although she is the daughter of the king, she is married to a member of the collateral clan. Mrs. Sophie is married to the Habsburg family, the second heir to the throne of the Austrian Empire, and her son may even inherit that ancient and huge empire in the future. Although there were rumors in the early years that Archduke Franz Karol was an idiot, over the years the Archduke not only defeated Vienna's smartest doctor in the park debate, but also proposed many major events that changed the fate of the country. People like to call him Silent Franz Karol. In this era, people often thought that doctors were the smartest people because it was very difficult to get a medical license at that time, and it was a highly respected job, although most of them only knew how to bleed and feed people opium. Although Ludovica's own husband has the title of civilian duke, this is not a compliment, but a kind of irony. As a duke without any position in the palace, he does not abide by the rules and etiquette and hangs out with common people all day long to call each other brothers. It is simply a shame for the family. The lakes and mountains on the shores of Lake Starnberg are indeed beautiful, but Ludovica would rather live in the city and live a glorious life. Many people evaluate Ludovica as a peasant woman without any ambition, but in fact this is not the case. Just because she did not give her children to servants according to the aristocratic custom of this era, but educated them herself, it can be seen that she was very dissatisfied with the current situation. But meeting a husband like Duke Maxi is enough to make any housewife despair. Duke Maxi, the father of Nana and Princess Sissy, is an all-rounder who climbs mountains, rides horses, fishes, plays music, and can also recite a few limericks. But Duke Maxi is not a good nobleman. His accounts are in a mess. He only enjoys and criticizes every day without taking any responsibility. He has children with many lovers and often brings them to his home. This made the relationship between Ludovica and her husband very difficult, and of course no woman would be willing to accept this embarrassing situation. So Ludovica pinned her hopes on the next generation. She hoped that her daughters could marry into good families. Nana is fine, but Sissy is too naughty. I'm afraid it will be difficult to marry into a good family. Mary, born in 1841, is still too young. Of course, Ludovica is actually very self-aware. She does not think that her daughters have any hope of marrying her sister Sophie's eldest son. But fortunately, her sister has many sons, including Maximilian, Ludwig, and Victor Jr. They are the targets of their daughters. Although Mrs. Sophie understands the thoughts of her poor sister, her children are the political assets of the family, and their marriage must be a political transaction. But perhaps out of sympathy for her sister's misfortunes, she promised Ludwika that one of her sons would marry into their family. Every time Mrs. Sophie came to Persenophen, she would bring some food and clothing to the Ludovica family. Of course not just Mariah's toys, but also some skirts and clothes designed by the former, as well as underwear, cosmetics, perfumes and other things designed by Franz. Ludovica couldn't put it down. Because they have been married for so many years, her husband has never bought her a skirt. It's just that she can't accept the fact that Franz can design underwear and cosmetics. It was hard for Ludovica to imagine that a boy would be interested in such things, but after thinking about the history of his family and the Habsburg family, it seemed that it was not impossible. On the other hand, a big event happened on the European continent. The Netherlands announced that it would join the German customs union. Although this incident had long been expected by all parties, it still caused an uproar when the news came out. After all, this means that the German customs union will become the largest economic entity after the United Kingdom and France, and its growth rate will far exceed that of the United Kingdom and France. This matter was strongly opposed by Britain and France. But King William II of the Netherlands was very resolute this time, and he only joined the German customs union, not the German Confederation. So the French made concessions, and the British, who did not want to be isolated any longer, chose to make concessions. What was unexpected was that the biggest obstacle to the Netherlands joining the German customs union was Prussia. Chapter 397 Newcomers joined the alliance. Prussia, Berlin. William IV was the country in Germany that was most opposed to the Netherlands joining the customs union. The only reason was that the Dutch industry and commerce were too strong, and they also had overseas colonies. The only thing they lacked was the market. If left unchecked, the sea coachman may be resurrected in the same place. As a result, Prussia's advantage in North Germany was even smaller, and the most terrifying thing was that both were big flying fish countries at this time. The country that consumes the most flying fish in the world is Austria. In the past, under the protection of the German customs union, Prussia could adjust the price of flying fish unscrupulously. No matter how cheap the flying fish from the Netherlands was, it would not be able to buy it. But things are different now. After joining the German customs union, the Netherlands gained the same status as Prussia. They had no reason to watch and not make money. The result is that a large number of flying fish will flood into the German market, which will directly cause the price of flying fish to fall. This is a good thing for Austrians who have to observe fast on Friday. After all, the price of flying fish has dropped, and more people can afford to eat flying fish. But this is not the case for Prussia, which means that the FIU market will change from a seller's market to a buyer's market in the future. As for wanting to reach an agreement with the Netherlands to control market prices, not to mention that the other country's relationship with Austria is far better than its relationship with Prussia. If we calculate it, based on its own production and consumption, it is impossible to let the flying fish it has worked so hard to rot. Lose. The Netherlands' own consumer market is very small and its fishery resources are extremely rich. It is impossible to get them to give up dumping. Of course, it is almost impossible for Prussia to prevent the Netherlands from joining the German customs union, because the Dutch control a large number of colonies overseas, which is what the German states lack. However, because the Dutch have a large amount of capital in their hands, and they are very likely to use this capital to invest in the German region, the poor and small states are not so disgusted. If Prussia wants to maintain its status as the largest power in North Germany, it needs to oppose the Netherlands' entry into the German customs union. However, one wave after another has arisen. Following the Netherlands, Hanover also requested to join the German customs union on the grounds that they had drawn a clear line with Britain and sided with the German Confederation. Now Prussia really had a headache, because no matter what the relationship between Hanover and Britain was, the relationship between the Hanover royal family and the British royal family was broken to the bone. If they want to engage in smuggling, it is not easy. The Hanovers do business with the British all year round and are considered very wealthy, and their shipping industry is relatively developed. Although their relations with Denmark are poor, they have good relations with Norway and Sweden. If Hanover is added to the German customs union, a large number of imported products will definitely enter the German market, which will also have an impact on Prussian industry and commerce. But these impacts are very weak for Austria, and it can even export culture and goods in reverse. Faced with this situation, William IV almost vomited blood. And his opposition was useless, because the Netherlands joining the German customs union had been agreed with Austria long ago, and Hanover Austria had no reason to object. At this time, the reputation of the Austrian Empire was at its peak, and other small states would naturally follow its lead. At this time, the Prussian finance minister sadly discovered that they were transforming into an agricultural country. Even if they occupied the Rhineland, they would have no advantage against Austria. especially after the addition of the Principality of Liege. Prussia's market further shrunk. The Prussian foreign minister proposed to borrow the power of the British, but this was collectively opposed by the Junker nobles and nationalists, because now getting involved with the British was simply asking for death. But William IV still gave it a try, but the newly appointed Robert Peel cabinet did not want to interfere too much in European affairs. Because the internal labor movement, economic crisis, and wars in colonies around the world had already made it overwhelmed. As mentioned earlier, the number of British civil servants has always remained at 3,000. This is the pride of the British, but an organization of this size obviously does not have enough ability to rule this huge empire. As a result, a large number of temporary workers and external personnel flooded the government. It would be better if the British Empire could remain strong, or if its leaders were extremely shrewd. But once there is a downturn, they will accelerate the rate of collapse. Robert Peel was a reformer who saw the crisis that Britain was facing at this time. He felt that the reason for the rise of the labor movement was because the gap between rich and poor was too wide. As a result, the reformer levied an income tax and adopted a progressive tax rate. This may not matter to the poor, but it is more uncomfortable for the wealthy businessmen than killing them. Many people protested, but Robert Peel's tough attitude caused some wealthy businessmen to flee to the United States and France, but in fact it significantly increased domestic taxes at the same time. Robert Peel also restructured the Bank of England to make it more efficient and inject funds into some important industries and colonies. The drastic reforms quickly alleviated the crisis of the economic crisis, and at the same time the labor movement also declined. In order to better implement the reforms, he also established a well-trained police team to monitor the results of the reforms. Robert Peel pursued free trade and supported lowering import tariffs while protecting the interests of industrial and commercial capital and actively exploring markets in particular. Trade with the United States has picked up significantly. This is the first time that trade between the two sides has increased since the economic crisis in 1837. He learned the lessons of the Whig Party and stopped dealing with European powers. Instead, he began to invade India, South Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America, South America, and Ireland. Among them, Ireland and Honduras were the areas he exploited the most. The former was closest to Britain, while the latter had gold and few native people. At that time, Honduras was considered the most populous country in the Central American Federation, but it was still too small in the eyes of the great powers. Robert Peel's reform of Ireland was to turn it completely into the pastureland of the British Empire. Under his operations, the Irish held even less land, and large tracts of land were labeled exclusively British. The harsh tax rates are daunting, but the Irish don't seem to react, because they are used to them. Prussia was at odds with the rest of the German Confederation, which Robert Peel saw as a good thing. However, he preferred to watch Prussia struggle in the German Confederation than to personally help Prussia. After the discord within the Confederation grew, Prussia could only rely on Britain. And Britain was not alone in hoping that Prussia would be left alone in the German Confederation. As for Austria's growing strength, the first headache should be for the French. This is a good opportunity to break up the alliance between them. What Britain needs at this time is to recuperate, rather than confront the entire European continent. Chapter 398 The Flying Dutchman. On February 1, 1843, The Flying Dutchman premiered at the Dresden Opera House with great success. Warner, the great artist, has become famous since then, especially when the Netherlands joined the German Zollverein, and he gained another wave of popularity. But the Dresden court musician got into some trouble of his own making. Before the performance of The Flying Dutchman, Warner complained to his friend Samuel that he did not receive the treatment he deserved in his hometown of Saxony. I have no geographical preference. My hometown, apart from its beautiful hills, forests, and valleys, is actually quite exclusive to me. These Saxons are a cursed bunch. Misers. They are slow, stupid, lazy and vulgar. I would have nothing to do with them if I could. I miss the sky in Paris, where the air is so sweet, the people are so friendly, and the river is so clear. In fact, people have long been used to artists' complaints. But the problem is that the date of publication of this letter happened to be when the Luxembourg crisis broke out, so we have to associate some things together as a result. The publication of this letter directly caused the actors of the Dresden theater to go on strike. The audience demanded refunds of tickets, and all walks of life in Saxony took to the streets to demand the expulsion of this traitorous court musician. Under the turbulent public sentiment, Queen Maria Anna ordered the expulsion of the musician whom King Augustus II of Saxony admired most. In fact, this great musician suffered this disaster because of Queen Maria Anna's jealousy. She can accept her husband finding a lover, but she cannot accept her husband being obsessed with a man. This is the greatest insult to her feminine charm. Due to the agreement with Austria, Saxony's strength at this time and Queen Maria Anna's influence were much greater than in history, so she was able to intercept Juana's private letters without restraint. Of course, in addition to her Royal Highness the Queen's jealousy, Juana himself also had big problems. He himself was a spendthrift, which made many people dislike him. Especially Queen Mary, who was frugal by nature, further intensified the conflict between the two parties. Juana refused to spend 100 florins to customize a uniform suitable for his status as a court musician, but he could borrow 15,000 florins to buy an extremely luxurious villa, which disgusted many nobles. House prices were very low at the time. 15,000 florins was definitely a very outrageous price. Due to the great success of the performance of the Flying Dutchman, Juana's talent was recognized by the art world, so Berlin and Vienna came to him one after another. Then this guy first said that Vienna was flashy and authoritarian, and then that Berlin was like a village. Franz could only lament that this master was so good at talking, and he was helpless. And Franz is the authoritarian and exaggerated one. He can only try his best not to embarrass this music giant. In fact, Franz was overly worried. Austria could tolerate even an openly rebellious artist like Chopin, let alone someone like Juana who simply made a gaffe. If nationalism hadn't been on the rise at this time, there would probably have been a group of people who followed and booed. However, this situation is not what Franz wants to see at this time. After all, there are too many ethnic groups in Austria, and if they are not kept intact, one or two extremes will appear. Moreover, although Juana was extremely talented in art, he was a mess in terms of financial management. Originally, the success of the Flying Dutchman would improve his financial situation, and he would go bankrupt in a few years, but at this time, he was expelled from Saxony, and was unable to repay his debts. He was in a mess. His wife once again escaped from her creditors and fled to Paris like flying. The legendary Flying Dutchman comes from the personal experience of Juana and his wife Minna, who secretly escaped many times to avoid debts and encountered several storms at sea. Sure enough, art comes from life. Although Franz believed that Juana's misfortune was his own fault, he did not want the king of opera to remain unknown. In fact, there are many people who feel the same as Franz, and the most famous and influential among them is Archduke John. As the late emperor's younger brother and a disciple of Beethoven, it is not surprising that he spoke out. But Archduke John was soon banned because he was a member of the royal family, but voluntarily gave up his status as a member of the royal family. Some of Archduke John's inappropriate behavior could lead to some serious problems, so he had to be silenced. As the saying goes, a rabbit dies and a fox grieves its own kind. At this time, big names in the music industry began to run around shouting that art is not guilty. Even Franz received letters from Chopin, Liszt, Robert Schumann, Carl Czerny, Paganini, Berlioz and others. While they were expounding their own views and defending Juana's operas, they also wanted to ask Franz for help. Of course, it is impossible for Franz to take the blame himself, let alone to argue that art is innocent. But this historical mistake was indirectly caused by himself, and he will find a way to remedy it. Schönbrunn Palace, Royal Gardens. Why don't you drink something you invented? Emperor Ferdinand I rarely came out for fun today, and he was very happy to hear that his brother wanted to treat him to a drink. Of course, Ferdinand I didn't really drink alcohol, just some water, because alcohol would aggravate his stroke. But the strange thing is that his brother did not drink the legendary Pilsner beer he invented. My poor brother, can you still eat what you pooped out? Ferdinand I and his chief advisor Sloat were both at a loss for words. They wanted to refute, but were unable to do so. Ferdinand I simply changed the topic. My stupid brother, just tell me if you have anything to do. Don't keep drinking here. If you give me a glass of wine and a glass of water, I'm going to vomit. I won't compete with you next time. The two brothers had previously made a bet that Archduke Franz Karol would drink a glass of wine and Emperor Ferdinand I would drink a glass of water. It seemed that the former suffered the loss, as the latter accepted the competition at the instigation of his chief advisor. The result was that Archduke Franz Karol drank 2 bottles of wine and nothing happened, and Ferdinand I almost vomited. After drinking 2 bottles of water, then Slot suggested that His Majesty the Emperor was ill and could not drink much, and that he should drink on his behalf. As a result, Archduke Franz Karol drank 3 more bottles, and Slot also drank 3 bottles of water and vomited all over the floor. Of course this bad idea must have come from Franz. My poor brother, your nephew wants to see the Flying Dutchman, so lift the ban. My stupid brother, it's taboo to change orders overnight, and you must have signed this ban. My poor brother, can't you be more willful when you become emperor? My stupid brother, I'm willful, or you are willful. These art people say that art is not guilty. Are they not guilty of painting the King of France as a pear? I don't want to be painted as an almond or an apple. Things. My poor brother, I think your head is more like a cucumber. And my son said, the artist's mistakes should not be borne by the work of art. The Flying Dutchman premiered in Vienna on April 1st, 1843. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 399, Civil War in the Land of Peace. Unexpectedly, Juana finally found a job and became the court musician in the Netherlands. Of course, this was indispensable without the help of William II's mistress, Miss Caroline, and the new financial advisor Hans Hofmann also strongly advocated keeping this genius. It is said that the newly appointed financial advisor's real name was not Hans Hofmann, but he changed it after studying in Prussia. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was troubled because he had received news about something he had never known about. According to Austrian intelligence, a civil war is brewing within Switzerland. Franz thought this was ridiculous at first, because in his previous life, although Switzerland often pretended to be neutral, let alone the civil war, even the flames of war had not touched this land. However, the Archbishop repeatedly confirmed that the locals did have this idea and received the support of the Pope. That's right, it was Gregory XVI, the miser, who opened the Holy Water Company and the Holy Spirit Bank. It is hard to imagine that such a short-sighted person could have such great ambitions to annex Switzerland and make it a direct territory of the Pope. After some investigation, Franz learned that this was not the handiwork of Gregory XVI, but a kind of inheritance. The Holy See has been formulating this plan since 1814, during which time it has gone through 4 popes. Roman missionaries re-established the Jesuit order and formed the Catholic Popular League to promote the legitimacy of the papal rule. The Papal States invested a lot of money in this effort, but with little success. When Gregory XVI came to power, he no longer wanted to waste money on meaningless things, so he sent a group of radicals to stimulate the local people. These high-ranking clergy in Rome even wanted to interfere in local public affairs. The absurd plan, the foolish approach, ultimately incurred the wrath of both Catholic and Protestant governments across Switzerland. The nuncio from the Holy See was expelled, and the influence of the Jesuits was diminished. The Swiss federal government even proposed render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. However, due to the dominance of Protestantism in the Union, the Catholic Popular League was squeezed out. This caused dissatisfaction among Catholic MPs and priests. Some clergymen issued a cry that our faith is in danger, which led many simple and devout mountain people to believe that the Swiss Confederation would persecute them, and they must resist in order to survive. At the same time, a priest named Bellet found the French ambassador and claimed to seek help from the French King Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was very excited when he heard the news at first, because there was indeed a French-speaking population in western Switzerland, and the whole of Switzerland once belonged to France. Napoleonic era, However, after being reminded by the old Marshal Soult, I looked at the map of Switzerland again and saw a piece of Prussian territory. Louis Philippe suddenly lost his temper. He was not afraid of the Swiss Confederation or Prussia, but if this matter involved the entire German Confederation, it would probably be like the Luxembourg incident. Coupled with the slow and unpredictable Russians, the Vienna Peace Treaty stipulated that Switzerland was a neutral country. If France sent troops to Switzerland, it would be tantamount to challenging this peace treaty. Russia is a member of the Holy Alliance, and it certainly doesn't want to see anyone destroying the system established by the Holy Alliance. Soult told Louis Philippe from a strategist's perspective only. Annexing Western Switzerland will not attract the covetousness of the Holy Alliance, because the area is mountainous and difficult to defend, and there are not many resources that can be used for supplies. There are many mountains in Luxembourg. The locals have to import their own food, but Austria and Prussia still sent troops. We can't take this risk, Louis Philippe immediately retorted. Soult is already a dying old man, and has long since lost the courage to kill decisively on the battlefield. If Gizzard had not been driven to America, he would have just wanted to spend his remaining years in his office. Now that His Majesty the King has made a decision, Soult didn't want to say anything more and closed his mouth. Louis Philippe had no responsibilities to begin with. At this time, France's layout was so big that it almost reduced the national treasury to an empty shell, which gave him even more reason to shirk. The result was naturally that Billet's request for military assistance was rejected. The Swiss Civil War was not only about differences in beliefs, but also about family conflicts and conflicts of interest. For example, the Crown family and the Horner family in Canton Schwyz both owned large flocks of sheep, and at the same time they were also involved grazing cattle in a pasture. In the end, the Horner family completely drove the Crown family out of Switzerland, and bloody massacres and naked interest disputes were also carried out in the name of defending the faith. From 1814 to the present, riots in the Swiss Confederation have never subsided. Just as the German Confederation regained Luxembourg, Switzerland's German population was also ready to move. But their actions were overshadowed by fierce religious conflicts among them. Aargau Canton is the area with the most intense conflicts, and local Catholics have even begun to recruit soldiers and purchase weapons. In 1841, a riot broke out. The federal government demanded the arrest of Catholic leaders, but local Catholics did not show weakness and attacked the local Swiss federal government and prison. General Frei Harlow led troops to suppress the local rebellion, an operation that killed more people than the entire Swiss Civil War combined. Augustin Keller even called for the permanent abolition of monasteries. This move against Catholicism was opposed by Catholics throughout the Swiss Confederation. Even because its approach was too radical, many Protestant states opposed it. Although Augustin Keller's approach was opposed by many people, because the Swiss Confederation at that time simply did not have the ability to implement its own will on the states under its rule, the matter had to be left alone. New elections in May 1842 gave birth to a new liberal government. January 16, 1843, Lucerne became the capital state of Switzerland. The capital state is the state where the federal parliament is located. The new government again asked Augustin Keller to stop his behavior, but he refused. The canton of Lucerne then sent a notice to other Swiss cantons, requesting that a parliament be convened to resolve the issue. But Augustin Keller and the Aargau cantonal government had long been prepared. Through lobbying and secret deals, they not only escaped sanctions, but also had the parliament pass a series of bills that were extremely unfavorable to Catholics and the Swiss Confederation. This was the scene where Pastor Billet asked France for help. Of course, in addition to this, the Swiss cantons of Lucerne, Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, Zug, and Fribourg secretly established an independent alliance. However, only what others don't know can be called a secret. The organization of this independent alliance is extremely loose and undisciplined, so that surrounding countries are fully aware of their actions. This naturally includes their enemies. France can only lament that this is really a wall that cannot be supported by mud. However, Franz was still very interested in taking back the Habsburg family's ancestral property, Eagle Castle, and by the way, he could increase Austria's German-speaking population. Chapter 400 The Civil War ends. In fact, Switzerland is a magical country. There are not only pro-French, pro-Austrian and papal factions, but also pro-Spanish, pro-Sardinian, pro-Dutch and even pro-Venetian factions. After looking at the factional relations within Switzerland, Franz's head hurt even more. Some people say that the Swiss are French who don't want to be French, Germans who don't want to be German, plus a group of Italians who don't want to be Italian. But now they look like a group of poor people who want to be foreigners, but can't point. But the Swiss are really resolute in exercising their right to asylum. They have taken in a large number of German, French, Italian, British, Hungarian, Spanish, Russian, Swedish, and even Ottoman people to take refuge in this country. In addition, the Polish Restoration Army also had a hand in it, and even almost joined forces with Mazzini to declare war on monarchies across Europe. Although he cannot be impartial or absolutely neutral to anyone, he can be regarded as a moral model of this era. They even refused to hand over Napoleon III. Louis Napoleon, of course. It also depends on the specific state. For example, Lucerne has long used 1/5 of its income to support the lives of exiles. Some states also stipulate that these exiles must pay refugee taxes, and violators will be driven out of their place. Theoretically, Switzerland is not allowed to admit foreign troops, but they have a very flexible bottom line. For example, the rebel teams in northern Italy, or the Sequoia army led by Garibaldi who fled into Switzerland after the failure of the uprising in history. The reason is that the number is too small, so it is not an army. Although Switzerland enacted a law in 1512 to stop sending mercenaries to France, Louis Philippe actually had a Swiss guard around him at this time. There is also a sizable Swiss mercenary army in the Netherlands. Even after Switzerland completely banned mercenaries in 1874, the Swiss mercenaries never disappeared. In addition, France felt that it was horribly stupid to hand over leadership to clergy. Obviously at this time, Switzerland's independent league or Catholic League needed capable people, not a priest. Priest Billet's appeal for help in France was unsuccessful, so he could only turn to another powerful neighbor to the east for help. This neighbor is naturally Austria. However, the senior officials of the Austrian Empire hated Switzerland very much. Metternich felt that they were harboring criminals. Count Korolaf felt that they were middlemen and hateful second-rate dealers, and Count Latter felt that Switzerland was a rebel camp. And everyone was dissatisfied with Billet's approach of going to France first and then to Austria. Billet's explanation was that he lived in western Switzerland, closer to France. This explanation obviously did not satisfy everyone, and no one wanted to hear his explanation. Of course, no one hopes that a civil war will really break out in Switzerland. After all, from the Austrian side, this is a destruction of the Vienna system. However, if Switzerland is allowed to carry out religious persecution, Austria, the guardian of the faith, will lose face. The result was that Austria issued an ultimatum directly regarding the possible civil war in Switzerland. The inviolability of the neutrality of the Swiss Confederation will only be respected if the Treaty of 1815 is not violated. The Treaty of 1815 refers to the Peace of Vienna. If the Swiss Confederation cannot strictly abide by the content of the treaty, Austria will have the right to withdraw its previous commitments. In fact, what Metternich did was simply apply pressure. He did not want the Swiss to revolt, which would set a bad example for the Austrians. Moreover, Metternich also hoped to deport those exiles. After all, those people were always a threat to European security. Of course, Metternich was not a fool. He knew how to force people into submission. Metternich deliberately delayed sending Austria's credentials, and instead sent notes to Prussia and Russia. The credentials of the three countries arrived at the same time, which represented the attitude of the Holy Alliance. In this way, even if the Swiss really want to fight a civil war, they still have to consider the consequences of being intervened by foreign powers. In fact, the supporters behind the Protestant Union in Switzerland are the British. Of course, without such a troublemaker, no one would be able to unite so many factions in Switzerland. But it is a pity that water from far away cannot quench the thirst nearby, and the British overseas cannot help Switzerland in the center of the land. However, it was the French who responded most quickly to Austria's credentials. They immediately issued a credentials requesting Switzerland to stop civil war and possible public disorder. Faced with the pressure of the two powerful neighboring groups, The flames of the Swiss Civil War were temporarily suppressed, but Franz knew very well that this was only temporary point. As the situation changes, so do the interests of all parties. Too many colonies and alliances in this life have distracted France's energy. But if it is unified and integrated, it will definitely be more terrifying than in history. By that time, France will not be so restrained, and will even actively seek to break the Vienna system. Of course, Franz will not let that happen. As for the Swiss Civil War, it is good news for Austria, or anything that can increase the population is good news. If everything wants to develop according to Franz's plan, the leadership team of the independent alliance must be changed. What a group of magicians can do is cheat food and drink, and cheat money. The name also needs to be changed. The name Independent Alliance is very passive. Franz is planning to change it into an Orthodox Alliance. Yes, the legal source is Switzerland's original permanent alliance covenant. The covenant of perpetual alliance is the foundation of the Swiss Confederation. If the other party wants to continue the civil war, this covenant must be overturned. But once this covenant was overturned, the basis for the existence of the Swiss Confederation disappeared. At the same time, because the civil war destroyed the Vienna system, Austria also conveniently intervened to sanction saboteurs. Of course, Franz did not want Austria to directly participate in the Swiss civil war if possible. Because if that time comes, many great powers will choose sides, and a war will be inevitable. Unless France can solve the problem directly at the negotiating table, and satisfy all parties like the Luxembourg crisis, that is almost impossible. However, there are still some difficult problems in the Swiss Civil War. That is, the distribution of the 7 cantons of the Orthodox Union is a bit outrageous, especially Fribourg state is actually directly surrounded by the enemy Free State. Although several other states are gathered together, they are also surrounded by free states. The only difference between the two is the size of the encirclement. What's even more frightening is that these Orthodox states are not bordering the surrounding countries. If the war started, even if Franz wanted to send supplies and weapons, he would not be able to find a way to do it. In addition, when it comes to religious wars, Archbishop Prussia is no longer sleepy and even opens up the situation. He assured Franz that he could win 1 or 2 states to join the Orthodox Union. At this time, the balance of power between the Free States and the Orthodox States was 13-7, and 3 states remained neutral. If it is true as Archbishop Prussia said, as long as he can persuade 1 or 2 states to join the Orthodox Union, the gap between the 2 sides will be further narrowed. In this way, Franz has more room for maneuver. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.